So, excuse me. The reason that I had asked Linda to ask you guys in your sort of introduction about the number of employees you have is that it just gives me some understanding of the degree of organizational complexity that you're dealing with. If you've got 5 or 10 people, it's different if you've got 500 people. So it just helps me to understand what you're faced with. The reason I asked about your primary competitive advantage is that one of my observations, and see if this matches your own observation, is that one of my observations is if I look at the last, I'm going to say 5, 10, 15 years, I think it's actually more difficult to differentiate ourselves than it's ever been in the history of business. That whatever we say about ourselves, everybody else says basically the same thing. You know, I sometimes joke that if I were to gather a room full of your competitors together and ask them the same question about their primary competitive advantage, often what would come out of their mouth is about the same thing you said, which would suggest that while maybe ours really is true, to the marketplace, they don't know the difference. Yeah, we got better service than everybody else and more expertise. Well, so does everybody else claim to have the same, even whether it's true or not. And so, if I'm right about that, the challenge that creates is that we're all in this commoditized environment where we all look to the outside world largely the same. And in a commoditized environment, how do potential customers choose? On what basis do they typically choose? This is a question.
Oh, price.
Yeah, price, right? I mean, if you all look the same, I'll just buy the lowest price. Why? I mean, that's the only thing I can tell. And what does that do to our margins? Right through the floor. So none of us want to be in this kind of environment where we're just trying to compete on price because everybody looks the same. Well, when you look at the research that's been done on companies that manage to succeed year over year over year over a long period of time in commoditized environments, what you discover is that the companies that manage to succeed over a long period of time don't win because of what they offer. They win because of how they go about doing it. The product or service you offer is so darn easy to copy. Yes, you have a level of expertise that nobody else has. Well, what are you going to do when somebody else has that expertise? Or you got a product that nobody else has that product. Well, that's great for a short period of time, but sooner or later, your competitors are going to have that product too. And by the way, your competitors aren't all stupid. Some of them are, but they're not all stupid. And they're looking at you, and if you're making money doing what you do, they're going to say, hey, shoot, we want to do that too. And it will typically take them a fraction of the time, effort, and money that it took you to create that differentiation. That's how long it'll take them to copy it. And so if you could somehow get your human beings to actually be better than your competitors' human beings in how they operate together, in how they work with customers, in how they work with vendors and suppliers, if you could somehow get your people to be better than everybody else's people, not only is that perhaps the last remaining opportunity for competitive advantage in a commoditized world, but I would argue it's actually the most sustainable competitive advantage. One of my favorite companies, we're going to talk about them later, is the Ritz-Carlton hotel chain. Why do people go to a Ritz-Carlton, by the way? Remember the Ritz-Carlton? Why do you go to a Ritz-Carlton?
Really nice. Experience.
Yeah, the experience, right? Yeah, nobody says, you know, they have the most comfortable beds in the world. Or I was in the reception, or you should see the furniture. Nobody talks about that. They talk about the experience they create for people. Well, Ritz-Carlton at their headquarters, which is in Chevy Chase, Maryland, which is just outside of Washington, D.C., in their headquarters, they teach classes that you can go to, I've actually been there, where they will teach you everything that they do. So think about this for a second. You could be the Hyatt Regency, and you could go to Ritz-Carlton's headquarters, and they'll show you everything they're doing, teach you everything. That seems kind of crazy, doesn't it? I mean, how many of us would invite our competitors in and say, hey, let me just show you what we're doing here? Would you do that? Most of us wouldn't. So why do you think they do that, assuming they're not stupid? Why would they do that?
This is another audience participant.
Yes. We have to get some clues here.
Yeah.
I'll go like this. This means you can talk. So why do you think they do that? Tony?
They think they're better than everyone else. They can retain their advantage.
Yeah, it still seems like a pretty risky thing, though, doesn't it?
Nope.
What do you think, Jacob? Why would they do that?
They probably have superior execution skills, and so they're probably not concerned that I'll teach you my secret sauce, but it's the execution that they're going to do that will, be the difference between them and everyone else?
Yeah, my guess about, I don't really know. My guess is, I think you're right, Jacob, that I think that for their people to operate the way they do is so baked into the culture of their organization, it's so baked into the DNA of how they operate, that even when they give you the special sauce, you're still not likely to be able to do it. And the reason I point this out is they're so unafraid that you're going to be able to do it that they'll give it to you. And what that points out to me is that if you could pull that off, if somehow you could get your people to be that much better than your competitors' people, even when your competitors figure out that's how you're winning, they're still not likely to be able to do it. And by the way, I'm not suggesting that it's not a good idea to have better products or better service or technology or whatever. It's just that those, to me, those are a short-term window of opportunity. For a little while, you got a technology that nobody has, and that's good. You should keep trying to do that. But that's not really a long-term strategy of differentiation, unless you're like Apple, and most of us aren't. You know, the chances that we're going to keep coming out with innovations that put us ahead of the marketplace, not many of us are going to pull that off. Maybe you can, but that's not going to be many of us. But if you could somehow get your people to be better than everyone else's people, not only is that the biggest competitive advantage, perhaps the last remaining competitive advantage that's available in this commoditized world that we're all in, but it's the most sustainable one, because even when people figure it out, they're not likely to be able to do it. And what we're going to talk about this morning is, how could you pull that off? How could you make that happen? One of my favorite books, one of my favorite business authors, anybody read any of Patrick Lencioni's work? Isn't he a great author? Most of his books are written, and you should read them if you haven't, most of his books are written in a fable format, like the 1 Minute Manager series where he tells a little story, so they're quick reads. But he wrote a book in 2012 called The Advantage. Did you read that book? Anybody read that? The Advantage is a really good book. Interestingly, the subtitle, it's called The Advantage. The subtitle is Why Organizational Health Trumps Everything Else in Business. And what he does in this book is he looks at all of his experience working with some of the biggest and most successful companies in the world, and he looks to see, like, what is it that makes them so successful? And he distills all of his learning into one place. And I'll tell you what he says. I'm going to save you the money. I don't even have to buy the book. I'm going to tell you what he says. He says that what it takes to be successful is two things, and they're both required. One is that you have to be what he calls smart. And by smart, what he's referring to are the traditional business disciplines that we think about. You got to have good finance and marketing and operations and strategy and all the normal things. The second thing he says is you also have to be healthy. And by healthy, he's referring to a highly functioning group of people. And of the two, which one do you think he says has the greater contribution to success? It's sort of obvious, otherwise I wouldn't ask it. Healthy stuff, yeah. And the reason he says that is he says that the health of the company operates as sort of like a multiplier effect. That for whatever level, whatever given level of strategy or operations, et cetera, you have, you're going to go 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 10 times as far with that strategy if you've got a highly functioning group of people. And conversely, you're going to go a fraction as far if you've got a dysfunctional, screwed up group of people. I mean, I don't care how good your strategy is, if you've got a screwed up group of people, you're not getting very far. So they're both required, but the greater contribution to success is in the healthy stuff. But then he says something really interesting. He does a whole bunch of research. He's a real research kind of nut. And he does a lot of research, and he looks at where CEOs spend most of our time. And where do you think most of our CEOs, where do we spend most of our time, on the smart stuff or the healthy stuff?
Smart stuff.
Smart stuff. They're kind of interesting. And why is that, do you think? Why do we spend more of our time there?
Because we're smarter.
Okay, we think we're smarter.
Tangible these days.
Yeah, it's a little more tangible, it's a little more measured, it's a little more concrete. You know, if we went to business school, we learned about that stuff. You know, talking about the people stuff, that's just kind of squishy. I don't know what to do with that. I could talk about sales all day long, and I could talk about operations all day long, but that other stuff is, and yet that's where the biggest contribution for success is. You know, he tells a joke in this book that I've heard told in a variety of forms, but he tells it in the form of an old TV program, an old episode, and I'm not even going to say how old it is because she would know this, but the old TV show I Love Lucy. And yes, you didn't know anything about that. And apparently there was an episode where Lucy's husband comes home to their apartment one evening, excuse me, and he finds Lucy crawling around the floor of her living room looking for something. And he says, Lucy, like, what are you looking for? And she says, I lost my earring. I can't find the damn earring. And he asked her, so did you lose your earring in the living room? And she says, no, I lost it in the bedroom, but the light's better over here. and he tells that because I think it's very appropriate for this topic. Good morning. That where we've lost our way, where the biggest opportunity is for really making a difference is on the people side of our business, on the culture of our organization, but it's really dim and dark over there. It's hard to know what to do. And so we spend all of our time where the light is on the typical, financial operations, other things. Well, my job this morning is to shine a light on the people part of this, to make this concrete and actionable and practical so we can actually get our arms around it and do something about this. So this is not going to be the fluffy, soft version of culture. This is going to be the hardcore, tangible, what do I do? What's the action I take to make this thing happen? And that's what we're going to be doing. Now, what's interesting about this is that you all have cultures in your company, right? Does anybody here not have a culture in your company? You can't not have one, right? Whether it's what you want it to be or not, it's a different question, but you can't not have one. You put human beings together and a culture forms. This Vistage group has a culture, doesn't it? There's a way that you guys operate. Do people show up on time? Do they not? How hard do you push each other? How revealing are you? What do you joke about? Are there any topics that are off limits? All that kind of stuff exists. Even a group of friends of yours has a culture. Think about a group of friends of yours that you hang out, that you go hunting with, play golf with, or in a book group, whatever. There are norms in that group. Aren't there ways that you guys relate to each other? Do you ever think about where that comes from? Like, you guys probably, Lee probably does, I bet. Did you and your friends go off site and do a retreat and come up with a vision and a mission and some core values for your friends? You probably did that, right?
All the time.
Yeah, I think it's probably an annual thing, right? Yeah. And yet, there's a culture in your group of friends, right? So where does that come from? How does that happen?
Personalities.
Yeah. Tell me more about that, Lee.
Just trying to get along with people.
Mm-hmm. You probably have different groups of friends, right?
Yes.
And I would guess that maybe those different groups have different cultures in them. So
Different
what
interests.
accounts for that? What do you think, Darren?
Probably in the environment that you deal with them in,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's the bar or the church or on the softball field, what have you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that certainly influences it. Let me ask you this. Do you think, picture your groups of friends. Do you think that everybody in the group has the same influence over the norms of the group? So tell me more about that, Darren.
Well, you have the various personalities,
Mm-hmm.
And depending on the strength of the personality and what they're like will influence it more than others.
Yeah, I think you're saying something that's really important. That I think Darren's right, that just my observation, there's no science behind this, I don't know, but it's just my observation. I think that you look at a group of people, and in almost every group of people, there is one or more people who emerge as leaders. They're kind of the alpha people. And they just, by the sheer strength of their personality, they tend to influence the norms of the culture of the group in a disproportionate kind of way. And they're not necessarily trying to do that, not saying, watch me influence people, but they're still doing it. They're the ones who say, how about we play golf at 8 tomorrow? Does that work for you guys? Yeah, it works for me. Well, who was it that said 8? Well, it was the leader. They kind of just dictate how things happen. And I think what happens is, as you join that group, even unconsciously, you may not be thinking about it, but even unconsciously, excuse me, as you join that group, if it works for you and it feels right, you stick with it. And over time, it gets reinforced. And if it doesn't feel right for you, you drop out. You don't want to be part of that group. But it's being heavily influenced by the strongest personalities. Now, why do I raise this? Well, I would argue that absent an intentional force on your part, and that's a really important thought, absent an intentional force on your part, if you're not doing something about it, the exact same thing is happening in your organization. That the culture in your organization is mostly being influenced by those people in your company who have the strongest personalities. And those people, by the way, are not necessarily the designated managers, supervisors, and leaders. They're just the people who happen to have strong personalities. And if those people happen to be really positive, enthusiastic, hardworking, quality-oriented people, this will be great. You don't have to worry about a thing. But if they're not, if they're cynical jerks with lousy attitudes, and we all have some of those people, they will influence the people around them to be more like them. And the reason that I point this out is if the culture is as big a driver of people's performance and of your competitive advantage, is that something we just want to leave to chance and hope that the right personalities are going to somehow magically influence it? Yikes, I wouldn't want to do that. I'd want to grab this thing by the throat and make my culture be what I want it to be, instead of just hoping it's going to somehow magically work out on its own. And that's what I want to show you how to do. All right, how could we do that in a much more intentional way? Now, quick background, since I didn't let Stefan do it, as to like, okay, so who the heck am I? What do I know about this? And why should you bother listening? Other than the door's closed, it's going to be embarrassing. You can just walk up and walk out and leave. So I do come from southern New Jersey, the Philadelphia area. I've lived there since I was very little, and I went to school in Virginia. Joe and I were talking about that before. He's a Virginia guy. And I went to school at the College of William and Mary, the second oldest school in the country, and I was a philosophy major in college. My whole business background was that I had a semester of accounting. I figured that way. And I got out of school and I went to everybody's dream business, the insurance business. I mean, don't most people grow up thinking, man, if I could be in insurance, that would be my dream. But there are actually people that like study risk management. Oh, how can you do that? But anyway, I got out of school and I went to, and the reason I got into the business that I did is, like many of us, my father was in the business. You know, it was a family thing. And when I started, it was actually just my father and I, literally in the basement of our home in southern New Jersey. And we were in the employee benefits end of the business, selling benefit programs to companies like yours. My father retired a few years later. He actually went to law school and retired full time, which is sort of an interesting story. But anyway, I went on to grow that company from the two of us to about 110 people, about 16 or 17 million in revenue. And during the years that I was growing that company, we were successful in almost every dimension you can look at. We were 7 or 8 times named one of the best places to work in the Philadelphia region. We were 5 or 6 times named one of the fastest growing companies. Any of you familiar with the Malcolm Baldrige Quality Award? You know what that is? It's the highest award you can win for quality, right? Most states have a similar quality program based on the same criteria. New Jersey does. In 2006, my company was the only company in the state of New Jersey in any industry of any size to win the highest award for quality you can win based on a Baldrige application. It's called the Governor's Award for Performance Excellence. So we did a lot of things really, really well. But the foundation of everything that we did was our culture. It's totally why people came to work for us. It's why they stayed with us. It's why customers bought from us. Of course, we had to have the services, obviously, they were looking for, but their comfort with our people is what caused them to say, I'd rather work with you guys than the people down the street. It was everything for us. And as the CEO of that company, I did a series of things in a very intentional way to make that happen, to create that culture. I eventually ended up selling our company to a large multi-billion-dollar publicly held company, and I worked for a couple of years running my old company as a division of this much larger entity. And then in 2010, at a nice young age, I retired. I was actually, to be honest with you, I hated insurance. Like, I can't imagine how, I never expected to spend my whole life doing that. What was always interesting to me wasn't insurance, it was leadership and organizational behavior. I just find it fascinating how people come together and perform in extraordinary ways. I just find that so interesting. And I spent a lot more of my time thinking and talking about that kind of stuff. Well, when I retired, I wasn't sure what I was going to do next, but whenever people heard me talk about the things we were doing in our company, they'd always come up to me and say, when are you going to write a book about that? And so I knew sooner or later I would do that. So in 2011, I sat down and wrote my first book, which is called Fundamentally Different. And it was a leadership book about the things I had learned and had taught to so many other people. And I wrote that book, I'm always very honest about this, I wrote that book as a closure step, as a way of bringing closure to my old career so I could put it behind me and go do something totally and completely different. Little did I know it wasn't going to quite work out that way, and what ended up happening is I had a former client of my old company who was in a Vistage group in southern New Jersey, and he called me one day after reading my book and he said, you know, that was really interesting stuff. You know, you should come and talk to our Vistage group. And of course I asked him, what's a Vistage group? And he explained to me the secret handshake, and he hooked me up with the chair of his group who screened me to make sure I wasn't some sort of a crackpot, and the guy invited me to speak to the group, and the talk was in my own hometown. And I like talking about this, and it was in my own hometown, so I thought, sure, I wasn't going to do anything other than that. And next thing I knew, I started getting these emails from the Vistage headquarters saying, will you go to Florida and Chicago and Boston and these places? And I thought, oh, I'm not doing anything else. And one of the first talks I did, I was in Chicago, and a guy came up to me afterwards. He said, that was really interesting. Can I hire you to help me do what you just talked about? And I thought, well, I'm retired. I guess I'll figure out what to do with this guy. And here I am 6 years later, and I've spoken to just about 300 Vistage groups in the last 6 years. I've worked with about 175 different businesses in every industry, from heavy construction to steel welding and fabricating to IT to real estate to law firms to you name it, helping them implement the stuff that I'm about to share with you. And I have another company, High Performing Culture, with 5 or 6 people, and bringing this content to people around the country. My kids tell me I've completely failed at the retirement game. I just didn't do it well. But I give you that background mostly to say that everything I'm about to share with you this morning comes from my experience having created it all as the CEO of my company and having done it in so many companies in so many different industries. I always tell people, if you have humans in your company, this will work. If you don't have humans, it just isn't going to fly for you. You get the human types, this is going to work. All right, enough of that. Let's get down to work. So here's what I want to do. Oh, good, we got some markers there. I want to introduce you to a framework, a series of steps, a roadmap for what it takes to, there's a word that I like to use, to institutionalize our culture. What do you think I mean when I use that word, to institutionalize it? What does that mean to you, Chris, to institutionalize it?
Make a process out of it?
Yeah, it's part of it, making a process out of it. Jim, what does that mean to you?
Institutionalized to, make everything function together.
Yeah. Mark, what does that mean to you?
I think it's just bringing it together as a working entity.
Yeah. You know, it's like, to me, I think of it almost like it's making it so baked into the DNA of your organization. You work here, that's just the way we do things around here. And I say this because I want to be very clear about the distinction between some people, when they picture culture, they're just picturing, oh, we got a nice vision and mission on our wall and everything that's done. Or we got a ping pong table in our reception area and we have pizza on Fridays. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about you as leaders have a vision, not necessarily fancy vision statement, but you have a picture, I'm sure, in your brain of how you wish your people were. The things you say, if I could just get our people to more consistently be like that, watch out, we would be amazing. Well, to me, driving a culture, institutionalizing a culture, is nothing fancier than can we get those thoughts out of your brain and into their bodies so when they show up at work every day, that's the way they are. That's institutionalizing. That's just the way we do things around here. That's what we want to do. So what I want to show you is I want to show you a roadmap, a series of steps that it takes to make that happen. And I call this roadmap, this framework, I give it a very fancy title. I call it the 8-step framework because there's 8 steps. So this isn't going to be complicated, I promise. And so what I want to do is I want to show you the 8 steps now. Excuse me. And we're going to talk about each of these 8 steps so that you have the big picture. But then what I want to do for most of our morning is I want to focus on 2 of the 8 steps. Because what my experience tells me is that while all 8 of these steps absolutely are important, there are 2 of these steps that actually have a disproportionate amount of influence over our success. If we do these 2 things really well, we're going to be like 90% of the way down the path. And if we don't do these 2 things well, we're not going to get very far. So in the interests of our time, I want to give you the big picture, but then I want to go do a deep dive and do some activities and things to have you see these 2 things that really drive success the most and how to apply them in your company. Because if you can't apply it, it's just a waste of time. So that's our game plan. All right, let's get down to work. So here's how I'm going to do this. I'm going to draw a circle. That's not too bad a circle. Sometimes my circles aren't so good. Now I'm going to bisect that circle, and that's going to represent 2 of the 8 steps, the 2 actually that we're going to spend the most time on. And then I'm going to draw, since it's Valentine's Day, right? So I'm going to draw 6 spokes coming out of this circle, and these 6 spokes are going to represent the other 6 steps in our framework. So 2 things in the middle and 6 things around the outer edges. The first of our 8 steps, and one that we're going to spend a lot of time on today, is the most obvious of the 8 steps, and yet it has to be our starting point, and that is that we have to be able to define with tremendous clarity exactly what we want our culture to be. Now I say this is obvious because how could you possibly purposely build and create and institutionalize a culture if you don't know what you're trying to build in the first place? It'd be like trying to, build a building and you just got a bunch of material and we'll see what we end up with, but we had no plan. If we don't know exactly what we're trying to build, we're not going to be able to do it very successfully. And yet, as obvious as that sounds, it's remarkable to me how few companies really can tell me this is exactly what we want our culture to be. Yes, they've got visions and missions on the wall, but I don't think it brings much clarity to it. You know, I often say that driving a culture, to me, is largely a teaching function. That's really what it is. It's not about the signs on the wall. It's about what are you teaching your people day after day after day after day after day. And if we don't know what we're teaching them, or we're not consistent about that, we're not likely to do it very effectively. You know, using that teaching analogy, I sometimes think of it almost like a curriculum. That if we were to take any of your companies, let's take your company, Carrie, you said you had 30-some people? 20. And let's just say, this is kind of a silly example, but let's just say that we decided we wanted everybody at CNTV to be really knowledgeable about American history. I don't know why, we just thought that was important for some reason. And I went to your leadership team and I said, all right, here's what I want you guys to do. I want you to go to everybody who reports to you, and I want you to start teaching them history. Just go do that. I'm guessing what might happen is that maybe one of Carrie's managers, when he or she was in school, I don't know, they thought the Civil War was an interesting period of American history. They teach all about Gettysburg and what happened. And maybe she's got somebody else who would be teaching all about, you know, World War II was a fascinating time, and somebody else is teaching about, I don't know, the Great Depression. And what we'd end up with is this wide diversity or disparity of what people learned about American history. Does that make sense to you? Mm-hmm. But let's say forget that. I got a different plan. What I really want is I want everybody at CNTV to be really knowledgeable about the American Revolution and the events that led up to the beginning of the war. And I built a whole curriculum around what I wanted them to learn. And I handed that curriculum to each of your managers, and I said, I want you to do this. I want you to take this curriculum, and I want you to teach this to everybody who reports to you. If I did that, do you think your people would have a more consistent level of what they learned about American history? Of course they would. Well, I would tell your culture is the same thing. If I'm right that this is largely a teaching function, then to the extent that we could define exactly what we want our culture to be, and we could build a whole curriculum around it, we're gonna have a lot better chance making sure that everybody's out there teaching the exact same thing and start to see greater consistency throughout our organization. So one of the first things that we're gonna do this morning, and we're gonna spend a chunk of time on this, is I'm gonna show you a new and different way to define what you want your culture to be and to build that curriculum around it. And I'm gonna warn you right now, we're not gonna do this by creating a vision and a mission and a set of core values, because my experience is most of the time it's largely fluff and it doesn't really do much. And so we're not doing that. We're gonna do this in a different way that's a lot more down to earth and a lot more practical and a lot more useful, but we do need to know what is the culture we're trying to create, and we gotta build that curriculum around it. So we're gonna spend a chunk of time on this. All right, the second step in our overall framework is one of the simplest things I've ever learned, and at the same time, one of the most powerful things that I've ever learned. I refer to it, I call it creating rituals. Creating rituals is all about how we make things last. Because we all have the experience in our organizations, I'm sure, rolling out new programs and new initiatives. This is gonna be great, this is gonna be game changing, and then 3 months later, life got in the way and we got busy and we stopped doing it. Now I know you guys haven't done this, it doesn't apply to you, but you probably have friends at companies who've done that kind of thing. And so when you talk to your friends about it, we figure out how not to do that. Well, the key to not doing that is this concept that I call creating rituals. And we're gonna spend a lot of time on it. It's, again, one of the simplest things I've ever learned, and yet unbelievably powerful. When I get done explaining that to you, you're gonna say to me, God, that's so freaking obvious. How come I didn't think about that? It is so simple and yet so powerful. But we really need to make this last. If the only thing that happens this morning is that you pick up a couple of tidbits of ideas and you mess around with them for a few months and then you forget about it, it's a waste of your morning. It's a waste of my time. I don't want to waste our time. The only way this is worthwhile is that I can show you the key ideas that will enable you to take what we're doing today and still be doing it 5 and 10 and 15 years from now. That's where we need to be. And it's going to be really simple. All right, the third step in our overall framework, I call selecting. When I talk about selecting, as you might imagine, what I'm referring to is how do you pick the right people to be on your team? And when I say the right people, I'm referring to people who are a good fit in the culture that you're trying to create. And the reason that's so important is that you're never going to build a high-performing organization with people who don't fit your culture. It just doesn't work very well. And the reason that's particularly important is that when people show up at your door to be interviewed or hired, I often say they show up at your door, I call them fully baked. What do you think I mean when I say they're fully baked?
They're
Well, they're adults, yeah.
They already have their system.
Exactly, they already have, excuse me, yeah, they already have their personality set. They're largely a completed deal. You can teach them skills, but the core of who they are as people is already largely done. And where did it come from?
Their life experience,
Yeah, and where's the most influential?
their jobs.
I'd say something even before that. I think your family. For most people, your family is the biggest influence over your value system. And I think your previous experiences add to all of that. But by the time they show up at your door, they're mostly done. And the reason this is so important to understand is you're not likely to have a lot of luck taking people who aren't a fit in your culture and doing some kind of an intervention to convert them into becoming a good fit. It doesn't work very often. You guys have all had hiring experience. You ever do this? I did this early in my career. Did you ever hire somebody you thought would just be awesome if they could just be different? Did you ever do that? Some people I told do marriages that way too. I'm told that doesn't work very well either. But I remember early in my career, I was building my management team, and the first management hire I ever made was a sales manager. And I interviewed this guy, and he came from the payroll company Paychex. Do you have Paychex down here? It's a very similar sale to the benefit sale. And this guy had a lot of sales management experience. He was really smart, and again, a similar kind of sale. But he had this one fatal flaw that I saw in the interview process, and that was he never knew when to shut up. So this guy would talk so much that sooner or later he would say stupid things that would undermine his success. But I was young and naive, and I knew that I could change people, because I'm that good. And I was going to coach him out of this. It was about 4 months before I ended up having to fire him. And I learned quickly, I'm not going to change the core of who they are. I can teach them skills, but who they are is done. And so the implication of that, of course, is we got to get good at picking those right people. And by the way, when I say people, that we need to get people who are a good cultural fit, I am not suggesting that it's okay to hire people who don't have the talent, experience, knowledge, ability, experience. I'm assuming you've already found that. And in addition to that, they have to be a good cultural fit. It's not one or the other, it's both. Now, that's nice to say, but in the real world, it's not that simple. I mean, people don't all walk in the door wearing a sign that says, I'm a good cultural fit. It's hard to judge. And we're never going to bat 1,000. That's just not going to happen. We're going to make mistakes. But I would tell you that there's a big difference between the mistake that we make being, I interviewed that woman, I thought she was perfect. I mean, she just looked like she had everything. But it turns out I just misjudged it. I didn't pick up on something I should have seen. That's going to happen sometimes. And there are things we can do to improve our hit rate and reduce that happening, but we're not going to be perfect. That, however, is a distinctly different mistake from the mistake being, I knew she wasn't a good fit, and we hired her anyway. That's the mistake we have to avoid, and we do it all the time, don't we? You've done it. You've hired people you knew weren't going to be a good fit. Why?
I feel like you need them.
Desperation.
It's usually, Mark, it's usually desperation. We're short-staffed, and we've been looking, and we can't seem to find, compared to an empty chair, they look pretty good, And so, we're desperate, and we end up finding somebody and saying, what, he's got experience, I know he's not a good fit, but we'll deal with it later. And then we deal with it later. 6 months later, we're firing the guy, and then we got to fix all the messes that got created in the meantime, then we got to redo the hire anyway. But it takes a tremendous amount of leadership discipline on your part to avoid that mistake. Again, it's nice to say don't ever do that, but in the real world, we are faced with legitimate challenges. When we got projects that got to get filled and jobs that got to get taken care of, when your customer service manager comes to you and says, Darren, I got to tell you, I'm frustrated. I mean, I hear you guys talking about service is everything in our business. Meanwhile, I've been short-staffed 3 people in our service department for the last 6 months, and we can't deliver at the level you're promising. Thank God we finally found somebody who actually comes from our industry, has some experience. And our HR director said, I can't hire them because they're not a good cultural fit? You gotta be kidding me. You want me to do the job or not? What are you gonna say? If you cave, you're undermining everything you're trying to do. But it takes a lot of discipline in that moment to say, I hear you, I understand, I'm with you. But we are not bringing people into this organization who we don't believe are gonna be a good fit. We're gonna work harder, we're gonna keep looking, but we're not bringing those people in. That's not easy to do, but we will never build a really high-performing organization with people who don't fit. Not gonna happen. So we gotta be disciplined about that. If we have some time later, we can talk about what about some of the people you may have in your company today who may not be such a good fit. who either you perhaps let in the door at a time that you weren't thinking about this in as disciplined a way, or maybe, excuse me, maybe depending upon your role, maybe you inherited some of these people. Or perhaps even some of these people may have been people who were a good fit at the time you hired them, but the company's changed and they haven't. What do you do about some of those?
Turning
Yeah.
down and new hire is, having that customer service person and being, and sort of saying, I need more people and trying to convince yourself to get rid of this person where you already are
I
short
know,
staffed.
it's hard to do. Yeah, and yet, are we really going to ever get where we want with those people? No, it takes a lot of discipline. All right, the fourth step in our overall framework is something that I call integration. Integration is my word for what some of you call orientation, or some use the new agey term that I hate. What do you call this?
Onboarding.
Onboarding, yeah, like who made that word up? I always joke, it always sounds like waterboarding to me. And in some companies, it's probably very similar. The reason, it's the word that describes how do you take the people you just hired and how do you bring them into the company. The reason that I use the word integration is I think it has a different connotation. Like orientation suggests I'm telling you about us, whereas integration is a word of assimilation. I'm bringing you into the fold, I'm making you a part of who we are. But whatever words you want to use, I don't care, it doesn't matter. The point is, how you do that process has an enormous influence over your culture. In fact, I would tell you that if I went to work in any of your organizations, that literally the first week I spend in your company is the most important week in my whole career. It's that influence. Why do you think I say? Do you agree with that? That's okay if you don't. What do you think?
You only get a, to make a first impression, you only get one time to make.
That's exactly it. You got one shot to make that first impression. And that first impression tends to be pretty lasting, doesn't it? Here's how I think of this. You ever notice that we all distort data to fit our picture of what we already believe is true? You ever notice that? We all do this. I mean, here's a simple example. If in Stefan's stirring introduction of me, he had shared with you, I didn't let you do that, but if he had shared with you about my Pulitzer Prize, and that I teach at Harvard Business School, I get bashful about this, he's going to tell you about this afternoon. But if he did, you would hear what I have to say in a certain kind of way, based on your perception of my credibility. But if instead, Doug had heard me speak somewhere before, and he sent an email out to everybody saying, I don't know why Linda brought this guy in. This guy Friedman's a blowhard. This is going to be a total waste of our time. You didn't do it, did you?
We blocked it.
Blocked it, good. But if he did, no. But if he did, I could say the exact same words, and you would process them differently, wouldn't you? Same words, but you would change how you hear them based on your preconceived notion of me. And we all do that. So here's how this relates to integration. I come into your company on the first day. And by the way, you're actually integrating people before the first day, aren't you? When does it really start?
The moment they're signing up, looking for a job.
Yeah, exactly. Even when they sign up to get an interview, they're forming judgments and opinions of who are these people? What's this company like? But just to make it simple, let's talk about the first day. I come in on the first day, and I'm going to put a pair of eyeglasses on. And those eyeglasses have a prescription lens in them. And based upon the prescription and the lens, I'm going to see things differently. I could wear Linda's prescription, or Stefan's, or Chris's, and presumably they all have a different prescription in them, and it's influencing how I see things. Do you follow my analogy? You have an opportunity from the very beginning to write the prescription for my glasses, to influence how I see and interpret and experience everything that's going to happen after this. It's like brainwashing in a positive kind of way. You get to brainwash me to see the world the way you want me to see it. And if you don't take advantage of that opportunity at the beginning, it's like allowing me to come in on that first day, and there's this big pile of eyeglasses here, and I close my eyes, and I randomly pick one up and put them on, and who the heck knows what the prescription is? Or worse, what if one of those cynical jerks we talked about before with the lousy attitudes, what if a jerk hands me their glasses on the first day? You think that's going to have any influence? Darn right it is. They're going to see everything through that pair of glasses, through that lens. So we got one shot at the beginning to orchestrate every aspect of the new person's experience to get them off to the right start. And it's remarkable to me how few of us do that very well. We spend all this time, effort, and money in recruiting and hiring people like Joe, and then we end up, basically throwing them to the wolves and saying, okay, good luck. Let me know if you have any questions. And we want them, they spend half their time filling out paperwork, and we wonder why it didn't work out. If we spent a fraction of the time, effort, and money we spent on the recruiting, and we put that back into the integration, we'd start people on a ramp to superstardom instead of digging a hole for them to climb out of. Huge, huge opportunity that few people take advantage of. All right, fifth step in our overall framework is a very simple thing. I call it making our culture visible. What do you think I mean by making it visible? And I mean this in a very literal way, so don't make this complicated. How do you make it visible?
Taking pictures,
Tell me what you mean.
videos, when you do things, events.
Yep, yep, writing it down. Yeah, it's like the stuff all over the walls. Now, I want to be really, really clear about this. I am not suggesting that if we put some beautiful signs on the walls or make some videos that we're going to magically transform our culture. It's not that simple. And we've all seen, do you ever see those success reports? You know what those are? A company that did that. They got the guys rowing on the river and it says teamwork and an eagle and it says leadership. And I go into companies and I see that stuff on the wall and I think, yeah, right, because nobody's doing that stuff. So the fact that we got some beautiful signs is not going to magically transform our culture. However, if our culture is real and it's authentic, actually the more I see it, the better. If the only time I ever see a physical written description of our culture is on the first day in the new hire paperwork sandwiched between the benefit enrollment forms and the I-9 is an 8.5 by 11 with our vision, mission, and values, and it's the last I've ever seen anything has to do with our culture, how likely am I thinking about it? How likely is it part of how we operate? Not very. But if everywhere I look, I'm inundated with things about our culture, because it is on the walls, and it's on the electronic display board in the reception area, and it's on screensavers, and it's on mouse pads, and it's painted on our trucks, and it's in the men's room above the urinals, and the women's room on the mirrors, and everywhere I look, I'm inundated with things about our culture. There's a much higher probability that we're talking about it, that we're thinking about it, that it comes up in our conversation, that it seeps into my consciousness. It's really just internal advertising is all it is. I mean, think about the fact that companies spend literally billions of dollars a year in advertising. Why do they do that? Assuming they're not stupid.
To make people aware,
Yeah.
Recollect.
And why do they want to make them aware?
so they buy from them.
Yeah, because it influences behavior. It influences whether we want it or not, it influences our behavior. Same is true here. The more I see that stuff around me, the more it influences me. And again, I want to be crystal clear about this. I am not in any way suggesting that this is a replacement for everything else we need to do. It is not. It's just a simple yet important element of additional reinforcement to everything else that we're doing. And you're limited only by your own creativity and all the different ways you can display it. The more, the better. All right, the sixth step in our overall framework is something that I call coaching. When I refer to coaching, what I'm referring to, excuse me, is how you use the day-to-day situations that come up in your organization to teach and reinforce your culture. You're going to hear me say this a lot this morning, that to me, your culture is not the signs on the walls, it's what your people do every day, it's the way they operate. And every day, you and the other leaders in your organization are giving people feedback. A situation comes up between two employees or with a customer or with a supplier or whatever, and you're giving them feedback about how you want them to handle it. Well, every time in that feedback, every time you use the specific language and vocabulary of your culture in that feedback session, you're pulling it off the wall and you're bringing it to real life and making it relevant for people. I'll give you a really simple example. In my company's culture is defined in terms of a set of specific behaviors that you're going to learn all about. And one of those behaviors is called honor commitments. Do what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it. It's something I'm really passionate about. And so let's suppose that Stefan is in my company and we have some situation in which we have failed to do what we promised to do for one of our clients. And I'm giving Stefan some feedback and I say, Stefan, just like it says here on the wall, honoring commitments is one of our most important fundamentals. So let's talk about what do we need to do with this client to make sure that we've honored the commitment we made to them. Oh, now I see what you're talking about. See, I could teach Stefan the exact same thing. But if I failed to use the specific language of honor commitments, I just missed a golden opportunity. It could still be a good lesson, but I missed a golden opportunity to connect the dots, To have him see that that stuff we talked about on the first day and that stuff that's on the walls, that's actually real. That's actually how we operate every day. Every chance you get to weave that language and vocabulary, which, by the way, would be very difficult to do if we never defined it, and also difficult to do if it wasn't around me anywhere. But every chance I get to use that specific language and vocabulary of our culture, I'm pulling it off the wall and I'm bringing it into real life and making this relevant and meaningful for people. Lots of ways to do that. All right, the seventh step in our overall framework is something that you already know about, but we still need to touch on it, and that is your own leadership example. You know this isn't a new concept. Your people are looking at you every single day, consciously and unconsciously, aren't they? And they're watching you, and they're figuring out from you what really matters around here. We could talk about all this stuff as much as we want, but then they're observing you, and that's really what's teaching it. And when you really stop and think about this, I know this isn't new to you, but when you stop and think about it a bit, I say that all of us in this room, every one of us as a leader here, one of our most important functions, it might even be your most important, if it's not, it's really high on the list, is that every single one of us here is a teacher. That's really what we are, we're teachers. And it doesn't matter, by the way, whether you want that job or not, you're stuck with it simply by virtue of being a leader. Because your people are learning from you every single day. They're learning from what you do, and they're even learning from what you don't do. You ever think about that? How do you think they learn from what you don't do? How does that teach them?
It's not that important.
Yeah, I guess it must not be important if you don't do it. I mean, think about this. You see somebody up in your company, and they're operating in a way that's inconsistent with what you say your culture is about, and you don't address it. What do you think you just taught them?
Rules don't matter.
I guess it doesn't matter. I assume you would have said something about it, otherwise I guess it doesn't matter. So they're learning from you. Whatever you do and whatever you don't do, they're learning from you. So when you really stop and think about that, I think there's two important implications that come from this recognition. The first is that you begin to become much more intentional, much more purposeful about using every single situation as a teaching moment. You don't let anything go by without teaching. I used to say in my company all the time, I spent so much time teaching my people how to think. And I don't say that in a derogatory way. I got fantastic people. But if I want them to think the way I want them to think, that doesn't happen by accident. It happens because I teach. You know, never does somebody come to me and ask me, so what do you think I should do? And I just say, well, do this. It's always, what's our philosophy about this? What does our culture say about this? How do we think about these kinds of situations? If I can teach them how to think about them, now they can start to do this in a more consistent way. So the first implication is you begin to see and take advantage of every situation as a teaching moment. Instead of getting in our typical automatic reaction mode, all right, do this, or get into action, you stop and you take a deep breath right now and you say, what do I want to teach my people by how we respond to this? The second implication of really appreciating the power of your leadership example is that you also begin to look at your own performance in a much more critical or analytic way. In other words, any of us who are not yet perfect, so if you're perfect, don't worry about this part, but if you're not yet and you're still working on it, undoubtedly, there are some aspects of your performance where you're not always the best example of what we're trying to promote, right? This is part of being human. But the question is, what are you doing about it? What's your game plan? How are you working on that? I'll give you a good example from my own life. I grew up in a family, maybe like some of yours, I grew up in a family of very high expectations. There's 5 kids in my family. I'm number 4 out of 5. I don't know what that means in terms of birth order and personality and all that stuff, but I am number 4 out of 5. And I grew up in this family where my parents just expected a lot. And so the way that kind of showed up in my upbringing is that there wasn't a lot of praise or acknowledgement in my family. And I don't mean that like nothing was ever good enough for my parents. It's just that like in my family, if you got straight A's in school, well, yeah, I mean, you're smart. I assume you would. My friends got straight A's, they got taken out to dinner. My family, that was just normal. And it wasn't a problem to me, it's just the way I grew up. And the way that showed up in my leadership career is that when I became a leader, I figured, you know, if I just hire good people, they'll probably do good work, right? They don't need to hear from me. And then I discovered this really interesting thing. They didn't all grow up in my family. And it turns out that that somehow most human beings actually thrive in environments in which there's a lot of what I call meaningful acknowledgement and appreciation. And I say meaningful as distinct from meaningless. I'm not talking about everybody should get a trophy because they showed up at work today. I think that's just BS. That's actually destructive. I'm talking about true, real, honest appreciation. When people feel appreciated, they perform better. It's a better place to be. And I thought that was an important thing to have in my culture. But I still get it, because that's not how I grew up. So what did I do? Well, I didn't say, that's not how I grew up. I'm an adult. How about I work on myself? So here's what I did. I'm a pretty organized guy, and I use an electronic task management system to organize everything I need to accomplish in a day or a week or a month. And the system that I have, there's a way of setting up repeating tasks, things that will come up every third Friday, every 15th of the month, whatever cycle you want. So many years ago, I set up for myself 2 repeating tasks, and these will come up every 3 days. The first one said, do a written acknowledgement. The second one said, do a personal acknowledgement. And what it forced me to do is to at least every 3 days walk up to a Michelle and say, Michelle, I gotta tell you, I really appreciate the way you handled that situation. Or to handwrite a note to Darren and say, Darren, fantastic job on the XYZ account. Do that every 3 days over a period of years, you actually get pretty good at it. And I actually turned that from one of my weaknesses as a leader to actually one of my best strengths as a leader. But I use it as an example of, okay, if I want that in my culture and I'm not very good at it, all right, well, what am I prepared to do about it? That's what I mean by being serious about your leadership example. Where are the places that you're not always such a good example of what you want to promote? And what's your game plan? What are you doing to work on it? And by the way, saying, I got to get better at that does not constitute a plan. Like, what's the real plan for working on your stuff to be a better and better example of what you want to promote in your company? All right, the 8th and last step in our overall framework, then we're going to get a nice breaking point. I call it creating accountability. And when I talk about creating accountability in this context, I'm not talking about general accountability, but rather more specifically, accountability for our culture. In other words, how are you showing ourselves, your people, the world, that you're not kidding? We're actually serious about this. Because if there's no accountability for it, it's just a wish. It's just a hope. So there's got to be some teeth behind it. A lot of different ways we could do that. For example, some of you probably do this. How many of you have elements of your culture built into your performance review system? About a third of us. So for the others, if I was in your company, and I'm sitting down with my manager, and we're doing some sort of a performance review, whatever that looks like in your company, and nowhere in the discussion is there any discussion at all about our culture, what conclusion do you think I'd come to?
Culture.
At least it's not very important. I mean, if it was important, I assume we talk about it. That's not the only thing we're talking about, but somewhere it ought to be there. Of course, once again, it would be very difficult to talk about it in a performance review if I didn't have much clarity about what it was in the first place. It ought to be somewhere in there. Here's another example of accountability. It's something that I do in my company and most of our clients. So I mentioned before that our culture, my company's culture, is defined in terms of a set of behaviors like honor commitments. And again, you're going to learn more about this shortly. So what we did is every year we did this survey. And we took the behaviors that defined our culture, like honor commitments and the others, and we wrote a statement of what it looks like to do this. So honor commitments might say, our employees do what they say they're going to do when they say they're going to do it. That's what I mean by honoring commitments. So there's a statement like that for each of the behaviors that define our culture. And then every year we would survey all of our customers, all of our vendors and suppliers, and all of our own employees. Same survey, but I wanted to tabulate the results separately. And on each one of these line items, we would ask them, in your observation of our behavior, do we almost always, usually, sometimes, seldom, or never do this? So now we're being really transparent, really accountable. Then we take the almost always, usually, sometimes, seldom, or never, and we break that down to a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 scale. And now we can put a number on how well we live to our culture in the eyes of the world. For those of us that are into continuous improvement, we could look at what our score is this year, and next year when we resurvey, we can check to see, have we improved the degree of consistency between what we say we're about and what actually shows up in real life. We can also look at each of the individual behaviors and put a score on each one of those and take a look at the ones we didn't score so high on and work on those to try to improve those over time. But again, we're being really accountable to the world. You know, it's not just BS. This is the way we operate. Let's get scored on this. So there's a lot of different things we could do to create accountability. But let me ask you this. What do you think is the single biggest thing you can do? The single biggest thing you can do to demonstrate seriousness or accountability for your culture?
Hiring somebody that isn't consistent with it.
That's exactly right, Andrew. That's exactly it. Firing somebody. You know, virtually every company I've ever worked with and seen has at least one person who desperately needs to be fired. They're a pain in the butt. They're opposite of everything we say is important around here, and they're still here. We bring them up to our Vistage group over and over again. We talk about them in every management meeting over and over again, and they're still here. You know, my anecdotal study of this is purely anecdotal, my anecdotal study of this is about 80% of these people tend to be salespeople. About 10% are usually in finance, and about 10% usually have some sort of a technical skill. And what do they all have in common that makes us hesitant to fire them?
Results.
Yeah, there's some results. They're good at their job. You know, if it's the classic salesperson, he or she is a royal pain in the butt. They wreak havoc in the organization. They're opposite of everything we said was important, but man, do they bring in a lot of business. Where they've got some of our most important customer relations. I'm not touching that. You got to be kidding. There's no way I'm dealing with that. You know, if it's the finance person, she's been with us for 27 years and nobody knows our numbers like she does. If it's the technical guy, he's got a skill set that's really hard to find in the marketplace. And those are the excuses we use for why we don't deal with it. We allow ourselves to be held hostage by that because we're afraid of what we might lose. And all the while, we're basically sending a loud, clear message to the organization. We're telling everybody, folks, I want you to understand our culture is really important unless you produce enough business. That's what we're telling them, aren't we? I sometimes say it this way, this is a bit blunt, but the best way for me to really know your culture is to look at the behavior that you tolerate. What you allow to go on, I don't care about the crap you put on the wall, what you allow to go on, that's the real culture. How many of you have ever fired one of those people? When you did, what did everybody else say?
Oh, God.
Thank God, it's
It
about
took so
time.
long.
And what did you say to yourself afterwards?
Thank God.
We waited too long.
Always. Should have done that a long time ago. I can't believe how long I waited. And you always, by the way, discover it's a lot worse than you thought it was. After they're gone, you discover all the skeletons that were in the closet. And interestingly, almost always, all the things you feared losing don't take place. The team comes together and fills in. Yeah, no.
Yeah, the tough thing is that if it's the right thing to do, then you're
Yes.
still going to be okay with that negative that happens.
Mhm.
I've had the negative happen too.
Yeah.
So
It can.
the
You're still. You're
reality
right. You're
is
still
a lot
going to be
tougher.
okay with it because it's the right thing. But interestingly enough, my experience is rarely does the negative. Not impossible,
Yeah,
but
yeah, no, I agree.
most of the time, you know, the sales that we were worried about losing, the rest of the team stepped up their game. Or the customer that we thought would be in jeopardy, no, they're fine. They understand that people leave. It's not that big a deal. And then we're kicking ourselves saying, I really should have done this a long time ago. But when we do that, think about the message you just sent to those who are sitting on the fence about culture. You got rid of Susie, and she was our top sales performer? Whoa, they're not kidding. They're pretty serious around that. I better get my act in gear. And by the way, I'm a big advocate for coaching and mentoring. So I'm not suggesting at the earliest sign of a problem we're getting rid of people or that you guys all go back to work tomorrow and said, you know, Linda brought this Vistage speaker Friedman. He said we should fire somebody. You're it. I'm talking about people we've been coaching and mentoring forever. At some point, you have to be on the team. Jim, you were going to say something?
No, I was gonna say, is it true potentially that some people that you may, at this moment, see things that don't necessarily fit what you're thinking, but you're also saying part of it's our fault because
Yeah.
we don't have a culture established that
Yes.
our expectations aren't clear what we're, you know
Yes,
what I mean?
yes.
So we can,
I think there's a lot of truth to that.
we're not
So,
asking them to change,
Jim.
but our
yes.
changes will make them better.
Yes, so one of the things you definitely will see is that in the absence of clarity about our culture, we usually have people who we can't quite put our finger on it. It just feels like they're not a good fit, but I can't really say why because I don't really know what our culture is in the first place, but it just doesn't feel right. As soon as we begin to get greater clarity about what our culture is, it's like, oh, now I realize why I'm so darn frustrated, because they're not like that. And we have something more objective to see them in light of, and to your point, we have something objective to coach them about. You know, these are the places that you're not living the way I need you to be. And so we have an opportunity to do better coaching. Now, Again, I'm talking about people who, you know what, we've been coaching forever. And someday, at some point, you just don't get to, screw with our culture and still have your job. At some point, you don't get to be on the team anymore. That is the strongest, loudest message we'll ever send. And we're not kidding about it. We're serious. So this is the framework we're going to use to think about how we could be much more systematic, much more intentional about creating the culture that we want. What we're going to do right now is we're going to take a short break, and we come back. Now that we got the big picture, it's time to now roll up our sleeves and get down into the weeds of this and figure out, so how could we define with much more clarity than we've ever done before exactly what we want that culture to be? How can we build that curriculum that I talked about around that? So let's do this. Let's look at your watch, your computer, your phone, whatever you're using to tell time. Let's add 9.5 minutes to it. And in 9.5 minutes, let's be ready to rock and roll. All right, we've got lots to do. We got the big picture. Before I dive deeper, questions on anything I've said? Are you tracking with me? Questions about anything I've said so far? All right, so we're going to keep rolling. So we want to begin to talk about now, how can we define with real clarity exactly what we want our culture to be, and how do we build that curriculum that I referred to around that? And to do that, I want to begin by drawing a very important language distinction for you. And it's an interesting thing because it's a distinction I did not used to think about even when I wrote my book. This is sort of post-book learning. And it's actually one of the two most important things I could teach you today. If you get nothing out of today except this one thought that I'm about to share, it's worth the price of admission, I promise, whatever Linda's charging to be here. And it's a distinction between what I call values and what I call behaviors. Because I think these are very different things, and I didn't used to think about that. Again, in my book, I actually use the language of values and behaviors interchangeably, as if they're just the same thing, whatever it is to me. But what I've come to see is they're actually very different from each other, and their difference matters. So let me explain what the difference is and why it matters. A value to me is an abstract concept. So examples of values are things like quality, teamwork, integrity, respect, loyalty, transparency. These are ideas, they're notions, they're concepts. A behavior, in contrast, is an action. It's something I can literally see you doing. I gave you each a card at your desk that looks sort of like this. Actually, it doesn't even look sort of, it looks exactly like this. And on that card is a list of the different behaviors that I teach in my own particular company. I show these to you at the moment simply to show you examples of what do I mean by behaviors. Later I'm going to explain where this all comes from, how it's all used. It'll all make sense. But at the moment I show this just as examples of behaviors. So some of the behaviors I teach in my company, I mentioned before, honor commitments. That's something you do. Practice blameless problem solving. Be a fanatic about response time. Get clear on expectations. Communicate to be understood. Do what's best for the client. These are actions. These are things that you actually do versus quality, teamwork, integrity, respect, etc. So a value is an idea, a behavior is an action. In parts of speech, you might think of it like a value is a noun, a behavior is a verb, a thing versus an action. Now, who cares? Big deal. Why does that even matter? Well, here's why it matters. The problem with values and the way that they're most frequently used is that because they are so abstract in nature, they can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. For example, one of the values that I see in many companies is I see many companies that have a list of their core values, and they have the value for respect. Anybody have that on your list of core values? It's a pretty common one. It sounds like a good thing. I mean, of course, why wouldn't we want to respect each other? But what does that mean? I mean, it means a lot of different things to different people. I mean, if you grew up in an inner city gang in Orlando, I know you got a lot of inner city gangs there. If you grew up in an inner city gang in Orlando, your definition of what it looks like to show somebody respect or to diss them, to disrespect them, might be a lot different than what it means in your family. Or think about regional differences. I know that in lots of areas of the South, children are raised to call adults sir and ma'am. It's disrespectful not to do that. Do that in the Northeast where I'm from, that's just weird. That has nothing to do with respect. I was telling the group yesterday, I have a friend of mine in Ohio, Columbus, Ohio. He's a school superintendent in a large school district there. And I was with him this summer, and he was complaining to me that the teachers feel disrespected because they didn't get a large enough pay increase. And he looks at this and says, it's a budget issue. It has nothing to do with respect. We have a certain amount of money and that's all we got. But they feel disrespected. And they're not right or wrong, it's just that we all have different ideas of what that word means. Have you ever had the experience maybe in your company doing something and somebody on your team was angry at you because you didn't respect them? And you're thinking, what are you talking about? It had nothing to do with respect. But to them, that was a respect issue. And it just goes to the fact that we all have different ideas of what that word means. So to simply say, well, we have a core value for respect, okay, that's nice. I just don't think it's very helpful because it's not clear enough. Behaviors, because they're action-oriented, tend to be a lot clearer, a lot easier to teach, coach, guide, give people feedback about than this broad, nebulous value. Now, I'm going to share with you a couple of stories that I shared with the group yesterday, are things that happened to me that helped me to start to see this in just a little more, in a different light and to get more clarity about this, and this will start to make sense to you. I was, a couple of years ago, I was doing a talk in the Midwest, and I think it was in Kansas City, and I was staying at a Marriott hotel. I usually stay at Marriott's. And the deal at a hotel, you guys know this, any of you who travel know this, what happens when you're at a hotel on the last morning of your stay, really early in the morning? Yeah, exactly. Doesn't matter what time you get up to go to the bathroom, right? It's always there. And this happened this time when I was in Kansas City, and usually the deal with Marriott is about 48 to 72 hours later, I usually get an emailed copy of the same thing. And when I get the email, I don't usually pay a lot of attention because I already have the physical copy. I scan it, I send it to Vistage. But this one particular time, when I had gotten the email, it caught my attention. Because what I discovered and noticed was that the amount that they were charging to my credit card was different on the emailed version than the piece of paper that I got. And it was more. It was less than I might not have worried about. It was more. And it wasn't a lot of money, but still, this should have been the same. So I pulled it up on my computer, and I pulled out the piece of paper, and I compared them line by line to see if I could discover what the difference was. And what I discovered was that the one that was on the email had one extra line that didn't appear on the other. And again, it wasn't a lot of money. It said $5.35 for room service. I thought to myself, well, that's kind of weird because I didn't use any room service. And in fact, have you ever had room service for $5.35? So something's not right. So I picked up the phone, I called the hotel, and I explained what the problem was. A woman answered the phone, she was very friendly, and I explained my issue. And she said, well, just a moment, Mr. Friedman, let me look on your account, and I'll see if I can figure out what's going on. So she put me on hold, she got back on a minute later, and she said, I found it, I know what it is. She said, that's the charge for the bottle of Fiji water that was in your room. And I said to her, man, that's an expensive bottle of Fiji water, but more importantly, I didn't even use the bottle of Fiji water. In fact, traveling as much as I do, I'm always on the concierge level. You know what that is? There's a lounge at the end of the hall, and they got the free food and the drinks and things. And I said to her, I left about 5 empty bottles of free water in the room. So you explained to me why I would have used a $5.35 bottle of Fiji water. And she said to me, you know what, Mr. Friedman, I get what you're saying. That makes a lot of sense. She said, here's what you can do. And she went on to explain, she said, you know what, the accounting office is closed right now, but I'll tell you what, I'll give you their 800 number. And I'm sure if you leave them a voicemail, they'll probably take it off your bill. And of course, I explained to her a whole different way we were going to go about solving this problem. But the point of the story, why am I telling you this? Do you think that she thought she was giving me really good service?
Yes.
I'll bet she did. I mean, she told me how I could solve my problem, right? What could be better than that? The problem is, her definition of good service was a lot different than my definition of service. And here's the issue. Let's picture this hotel, and let's just say there's a couple hundred employees there, and the general manager of the hotel calls a big meeting one day and says, folks, we got to talk about our culture. It's really important. And he's got everybody together. He says, here's our vision, and here's our mission, and here's our 6 core values. And our number 1 value is service. I mean, we're in the hospitality business. What could possibly be more important than delivering fabulous service to our guests? And that's what we're all about. Well, she thought she gave me great service, right? If they got 200 employees, they could have 200 different definitions of what service means. So to simply say one of our core values is service, big deal. I don't think it's very helpful. It's not clear enough. Now, I'll share with you a time I saw this done in a different way, a smarter way, that really got me thinking about this. I was in, of all places, Cleveland, Ohio. And I was in the Cleveland airport. And I was walking through the terminal in the Cleveland airport, and lo and behold, in front of me is a big sign, and it has the Cleveland airport's vision, mission, and values. I thought that was kind of unusual. I've never seen that in there. I didn't notice it here in Orlando. And I got to tell you, we don't have it in Philadelphia. There's no values going on in Philadelphia at all. And so being in the business, these days, I stopped to look at it. I actually took a picture of it with my iPad. And what really caught my attention, beyond the fact that it was unusual to see this in an airport, is the way that they constructed it. And it was really interesting. I'm not going to quote this accurately, but the construction's accurate. What they did is they had their vision, their mission. There were like 6 or 7 core values that Cleveland Airport. But underneath each value, there was a series of bullet-pointed statements. And here's what it looked like. It said, we value service. We demonstrate this by doing the following things. Bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point. We value quality. We demonstrate this by doing the following things. Bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point. Those bullet points are behaviors, aren't they? You might think of a behavior as the action form of a value. It's how I live to the value is by actually doing something. That's really what a behavior is. I thought that was a pretty smart approach. Well, having worked with so many different companies all over the country, helping them to define more clearly what they want their culture to be, what I've discovered is, of course, there are many different approaches we can take to do this, but 2 approaches in particular that I've found to be effective. The first approach I cleverly call the Cleveland Airport method. You know, we could define a set of core values. How many of you have ever defined core values before? Most of us have. We could define a set of core values, and for each of our core values, we could write the corresponding behaviors that help us to describe in clearer terms the actions that support those values. Perfectly logical way of doing it. But there's another way of doing it that I did in my own company years ago, not knowing about any of this, and it's actually what all of our clients do. And this is going to sound sacrilegious to some people, so I'm just going to apologize in advance. We could skip the whole values discussion and go right to the behaviors. Because, you know, at the end of the day, that's what we want people to do. We just want to do something. Why don't I just make that happen? What do I need that other stuff for? Now, that sounds kind of weird because the whole world says, you know, you can't run your company without identifying your core values. It's really important. And I say, I don't know. I'm not so sure about that. What I know is you need to have the behaviors because that's what you're going to operationalize. The other stuff, I don't know. Now, what's interesting is I used to say to people, look, you know what, either approach is fine. If it feels better for you and you're just more comfortable defining your culture in terms of your core values and then further delineating the behaviors that support it, go ahead if that works better for you. And if you'd rather just skip the extra steps and just more quickly get right to the heart of the matter and go right at your behaviors, that's cool too. As long as you get to the behaviors, what difference does it make? I used to say that, but I actually don't say that anymore. Because what I discovered, it was really interesting when I figured this out, what I discovered is that those 2 methods actually yield 2 different lists of behaviors. Why would that be? Why would the Cleveland Airport method give me a different list than my own?
I guess when you start with the values, maybe you feel like you're a little constrained if that behavior really does fit within that little silo that you created. Whereas
Yes.
maybe you have some other behaviors that you want, but they don't fit.
That's exactly it, Andrew, exactly. So what Andrew's saying, he gets a gold star this morning. He came to play today. Yeah, what interesting is, in the Cleveland Airport method, what we're really doing is introducing a constraint, a limiter to our thinking. And I can draw this for you, and this will be really clear when I draw this. So in the Cleveland Airport method, we ask ourselves, so what are my values? What do I really believe in? What's important to me? And just to make it simple, let's just assume we had 4 of them. Let's call them value 1, value 2, value 3, and value 4. And I'm going to put a box around them. And we could even give them a name. Somebody give me value. What's value 1?
Collaboration.
Collaboration 2.
Respect.
All right, got the respect in there. 3. This isn't that hard.
Teamwork.
Teamwork. And 4.
Customer service.
Customer service. All right. So we're gonna have a lot of collaboration. We're gonna respect each other. We're gonna work together as a team, and we're gonna deliver great customer service. And then we ask ourselves, okay, I like those values. It's important to us. That's really core to us. But what do they really mean in action? Well, when we talk about collaboration, what we're really talking about is behaviors like this, and this one, and this one, and that one. And I don't know what you mean by respect, but what I mean is doing behaviors like this, and this, and this, and this. That's what I mean when I say respect. And by teamwork, I'm talking about these kind of behaviors, and by customer service, this is what we really mean. So now we got 4 clear values. We understand exactly what we mean. I don't care if anybody else doesn't understand, but we know what we mean by those, and life is good. But here's the issue. It's what Andrew raised. It turns out that there are some behaviors that are really important to success that are over here, or here, or here, or here, and they're never even going to come up in our conversation. We're never even going to talk about them. They're not even going to be on the drawing board because we limited ourselves to only thinking of the things that fit inside those boxes. Do you follow me? Now, to be clear, and I'll give you some examples, but to be clear, I'm not suggesting these are diametrically opposed. There might be 85% overlap, but there might be 15% of items that are really important that would never even be on the drawing board if we limited ourselves to only considering the things inside those boxes. I'll give you a simple example. In my company, one of the behaviors that I teach, I mentioned it before, I call it get clear on expectations. And the issue here is that I always say we judge situations not by what happens, but rather by how it compared to what we thought was going to happen or expected to happen. So a really simple example, you're on the phone with a customer and they got some big issue and you say, let me research that, I'll find out what's going on and I'll get back to you as soon as I can, I promise. Whatever that means. You call them back tomorrow morning and you're so proud of how quickly you resolve this and they're angry because they thought as soon as I can meant like in the next half hour. Did you ever have that happen to you? Change that story. You call them back tomorrow morning and they thought it was going to take 2 weeks to resolve. They are blown. You guys are amazing. How did you pull this off so fast? Now, in both examples, you did the same thing, right? You got back to them tomorrow morning. But in the first example, you're a bum. And the second example, you're a hero. And what was the difference between the two?
Expectations.
Their expectations. If they expected it in a half hour, you're a bum. If they expected it in 2 weeks, you're a hero. So it turns out it actually doesn't matter what you do. It really doesn't. The only thing that matters is how did what you do compare to what they thought you were going to do. Now, if you have no idea what they thought, you're just rolling the dice, hoping it works. So why would you do that? Instead of saying sloppy things like, as soon as I can, because I don't know what that means, we learn to be more specific and clear in our language. When do you need this by? I'll have this to you by tomorrow at 9. Does that work for you? And we engage in a conversation to be clear. We are often inadvertently, but nonetheless, sloppy in our language. When we say things like, when you get a chance, could you do that? What does that mean? Or how about here's the great one. When is that part going to ship? Shouldn't be much longer now. What the heck does that mean? It means different things to different people, and we're going to be judged not by what happens, but by how compared to what they expected. So I knew that if I could get my entire organization to be really rigorous in our conversations with each other, with customers, with suppliers, and make sure that in every conversation, everybody's on the same page, we're all clear about the expectations, we're going to be way more effective in how we operate as a company. And I want my people to do that. Now, which value would that fall under? I don't know, and I don't care. I just want my people to do it. And more importantly, had I thought of my values and only considered the things that fit inside those boxes, would I ever have thought about get clear on expectations? Maybe, but probably not. So it turns out there are a number of behaviors that are really important to success that we wouldn't even talk about, wouldn't even think about if we limited ourselves to just thinking of the things that fell inside those boxes. Now, what's interesting is some people will say to me, oh, I get that. So we could just kind of figure out our behaviors. Couldn't we just kind of go in reverse? And after we figure out our sort of free-form our behaviors, distill it down to, well, what are the values that might be embedded in there? And my response to that is, I guess we could, but why? I mean, if my goal was to get to the behaviors and I'm already there, what am I going backwards for? There really isn't any need to. And in fact, what ends up happening from a purely practical standpoint is we end up saying, all right, I got this behavior. Well, I guess it's really about collaboration. But you could argue it's about respect. I don't know where to, I didn't write it for that purpose. I don't know where to put it. Or I end up with 7 things in this box and 2 in that. Does that mean this is 4 times as important as, no, I didn't write it for that reason. It's just not necessary. So I'm going to suggest that we define our cultures not in terms of the core values, but rather in terms of the behaviors that you say, man, if we could get our people doing that, watch out, we'd be pretty extraordinary. Pretty clear so far?
Can I ask you a
Yeah.
question?
Mm-hmm.
So how important do you think it is that it's catchy or memorable? Like
Not
I just
at
looked
all.
up, I remember last time I traveled to the Stanford airport, they're SFB, and now they're simpler, faster, better. So they've mastered that. Or I read about a company that's values were PBR. Well, by coincidence, when you start there, you get a Pabst Blue Ribbon, and they always have Pabst Blue Ribbon because of the values, whatever they were. PBR.
Yeah.
Do you think they need to be memorable
No, I
and
don't.
catchy?
No, I think it's overdone.
Yeah.
And here's why.
But this, I
Yes.
wonder, this is a lot.
Yeah, and I'm gonna say, yeah, when I'm done, you're gonna not see it that way.
Yeah?
So yeah, I promise.
Okay. So it doesn't have to be like,
No, it doesn't. So what I would ask, and it's a very, very, very common concern, and a legitimate concern. I totally get it. So I don't mean to demean that. That's a
No, I
legitimate
just wonder how
concern.
they
So here's what I would say to you. It turns out that there are a lot more things that are important to teach than 3 things.
or 7
Or
10.
exactly. And my goal, the reason to have one of those short, catchy things is because people can memorize it. So is my goal to have them memorize it, or is my goal to have them live the way I want them to live? I would argue it's the latter. And there's more than 3 things I want to teach people. And so my goal isn't, to be able to have something that people can spout off. My goal is to have them live the behaviors that drive success in our organization. That's what I want to achieve. And I'm going to show you how to do that and why the number won't matter.
Okay.
So I get it, and when I'm done and I build the logic to this, you're going to see why it's just not a concern. But it's a totally understandable concern.
Yeah, because we have 7, and we
Yeah.
worry that that's too many.
Yeah, you're going to have more when I'm done. Yeah.
There
Yeah.
you go.
Yes, you do, and I'll show you why. All right? Now, in a minute, we're going to do a little exercise to have you take a stab at trying on a couple of behaviors, trying to write a little bit of behaviors, because it's important for you to try this, and that way I can give you some feedback about it. But before we do that, I want to identify 3 mistakes that I frequently see companies make when they try to do this work. And I want to identify these so we can avoid these mistakes. So here's the first mistake. Too often, companies make this too collaborative a process.
That's our first value.
I know. Why do you think? Well, it's not about everything. So why do you think I call that a mistake? I mean, shouldn't you have everybody involved?
Who's driving the bus?
That's a good question, Darren. Who's driving the bus?
Never pick a destination.
Yeah.
It's like asking your family where do you want to go to eat, and you get
Yeah.
7 different responses.
Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, to your point, Darren, who's driving the bus? This is a leadership function. If you're the CEO, it's your responsibility, not just a right, it's your responsibility to lead the organization, to say, this is the awesome, extraordinary, amazing company we're building around here. That's what leaders do. To a certain extent, I don't care what everybody else thinks, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way. It's not up to them. It's my job as the leader to be the author of what we're trying to build around here. Now, to be clear, most of you are large enough, if not all of you, that you have a senior leadership team. Some of the people are even here. I'm a big advocate, actually, for the inclusion of your senior leadership team. But I'm going to be very careful in my language here, so pay attention to how I say this. I'm a big advocate for the inclusion of your senior leadership team for their contribution to your thinking. Notice how I said that. For their contribution to your thinking. In other words, if you're the CEO, it's what I want it to be. Now, I have a team of people around me, and by the way, this is not to make them feel good. No, it's because they're smart, because these are good people. They got a lot of good contributions to make. I value their opinion. But at the end of the day, those thoughts are being added to my own, and I'm the one who's going to decide what's in and what's out. It's not a majority vote. It's not a consensus. It's not let's make sure everybody gets a little what they'd like to see. It's what I want it to be. That's my job, is to lead the organization to where it's going. And by the way, you're not going to come up with something that your people are going to say, oh my God, that's not what I thought we were doing. No, they've already implicitly signed up for your game. Even if you've never been that clear about what it is, they've already signed up for it. But if they don't, that's okay, because this is where we're going, and I'm going to get a bunch of people who want to go there. If you don't want to go there, you probably should go work somewhere else, because this is where we're heading. That's what leaders do. You know, I often say this is a design function. We are designing the extraordinary company we're trying to build. We're designing it around what's in our brain, what's our vision. We're not designing it around the employees we happen to have on February the 14th of 2018 and what they'd like to see. No, this is a leadership function. Pretty clear on that? All right. And side comment here. Sometimes people will want to collaborate more and have more people involved because they want to get people engaged. And I'm a big believer in the importance of engaging our workforce. However, they don't need to have authored it to be engaged. How we roll it out to them can accomplish all the engagement in the world, and they'll be totally engaged and participating. They don't need to have authored it to create that engagement. Okay? All right, second mistake I see companies make. Too often, they try to write things that will sound good. And what I mean by that is this is where they write the fluffy things that don't mean anything. So here's my best example of this. Somebody years ago started this thing. It's probably the same guy who started the onboarding thing. Started this thing where we're all going to exceed our customers' expectations. I see it on everybody's websites and painted on their trucks. Ugh. And maybe we're serious about that, but if we are, I'm assuming we have some way that we document every customer's expectations, because how could we exceed them if we didn't even know what they were? And we're probably measuring the degree to which we exceeded them, right? It's one of our most important elements. And of course, if we kept exceeding them, eventually they would just keep raising them to the point where it would become impossible to exceed them. But it sounds nice. And we're not doing that. What we're writing instead are the stuff that matter to you. So how do you do this? You look inside yourself. What are the things that you say, boy, if I could get our people to more consistently do that, we would be kicking some butt? What are the things that you say that when you get up on your high horse and you pontificate about how the world ought to be, what are you usually pontificating about? What do you go on rants about? And if you're not sure, ask the people around you. There goes Ladies on one of his kicks again. You know, you wouldn't rant about it if it wasn't important. You know, it's why you're ranting about it. Here's one of my favorite, or two questions. One question, think about the things that drive you the most nuts. Oh, it drives me crazy when I see people do that. If it drives you crazy, you got some energy about that. What's the opposite of that? What would they be doing if they weren't doing that thing that drives you nuts? Here's a really simple question. Typically, my experience is that in almost every department of our company, we usually have one or more people who we wish we could clone. The people who said, if I had 3 more women like her, watch out, or 2 more guys like that, we'd be amazing. Picture the people you wished you could clone. What do they do that makes you want to clone them? I mean, that's a pretty good list of behaviors. You know, sometimes picturing a real human makes it easier to think of than just being an abstract idea. So picture your best people and what they do. The reason this is so important is that it's very difficult for you to be a true and authentic leader of things you don't believe in, but you just wrote them because you heard them somewhere. And it's just being fake. And conversely, it's easy for you to be a true and authentic leader of things that are always coming out of your mouth anyway. If this is what you're always talking about, well, yeah, why don't we just write that stuff down and start teaching it? So bottom line is be you, be real. It's you. All right, third mistake I see companies make. So first is make it too collaborative. Second is writing a bunch of fluffy nothings. The third mistake I see companies make is that too often they try to write this as a marketing piece. You should buy from us because look at our 4 core values. I've never bought from a company because I read their core values. I don't know if you have. I haven't. But even if I did, that's not what this is. This is the owner's manual for what it looks like to be a great employee in our company. This is the instruction. This is the curriculum we're writing for our own team. We're writing to our own people. Now, to be crystal clear about this, there's nothing wrong with sharing it externally. I mean, I gave you a copy of mine. I wrote a whole book on mine. So I'm proud to share my stuff, and you should be proud to share yours. But I would have written it differently if I was writing to my customers versus writing to my own people. This is a place where if there's certain vernacular or vocabulary or jargon that's kind of your language, that you talk, the way you talk in your company, use it. The more you use your own language, the more it feels real to your people instead of it sounding like a bunch of consultant speak or marketing speak. You know, talk to your own people. But it's okay to share it externally. Do you see the difference between the two? You're writing to your own people. All right. I've been talking enough. You guys need to do some work. So here's what I want you to do. If you open up this booklet, you will notice, if you open this up, that on the left-hand inside cover is just an outline of what we're covering, and then there's a nice color drawing of the 8-step framework, and you're thinking, darn, if you gave that to me before, I wouldn't have had to write all that, but it was good for you to write it. Behind that is a page for each of the 8 steps in the framework. And so I'd like you to turn to page 3, and on the top it says Defining the Culture. These pages are all set up in a similar way. We'll only have a chance to do a couple of the exercises, but you can do the others on your own. On the top it has the name of the step, then it has some bullet points of key ideas I'd like you to remember when you go back to your office. Then it has an exercise to do and then an example of how to do the exercise. So the exercise I want you to do right now is I want to take about 5 minutes, and I want you to take a stab at writing 2 behaviors that you say would make a difference in your company. 2 things that you say, if I could get our people to more consistently do this, we'd be that much more successful. And the way that I want you to write them is I want you to write them in a very particular way. I want you to write them in a similar style to the way these ones are on the card. Specifically, what I mean by that is that you'll notice that each of those has a name, and then it has a several sentence description, 2, 3, 4 sentences, that explain a little more fully what that looks like in action. So the example I've given you here is that one of my behaviors is called communicate to be understood. I can't stand, when I was in the insurance business, people speaking insurance to people instead of English, or using technical jargon that the audience doesn't know. So the title is communicate to be understood. The description says know your audience. Write and speak in a way that they can understand. Avoid using internal lingo, acronyms, and industry jargon. Use the simplest possible explanation. That's what I mean when I say communicate to be understood. So there's a title, communicate to be understood, and a description. So what I want you to do right now is to take a few minutes. I want you to write 2 behaviors that you say would make a difference in your company. And for each of them, what's the name of it, title, and what's the brief description that explains a little more fully. Everybody clear on that? Let's do that right now. And for the second part of this exercise, we're going to work in pairs. So we have a nice even number. So we will make, so Carrie and Maria will be a pair. Mark and, is it Sunit? Is that how you pronounce it? Brian and Chris, Jacob and Andrew, Jody and Tony, Joe and Jim, Doug and Darren, Claire and Lee, and Michelle and Stefan. So I'll use Linda and Carrie as my example. When I say to go, Carrie and Maria. When I say to go, Carrie, I'd like you to read to Maria one of the behaviors you wrote, exactly the way you wrote it. What's the name, what's the description? In this case, I was going to say that Maria will pretend she was a member of your company, so she can really pretend. But what I'd like you to do, Maria, is I'd like you to give her feedback. So is that pretty clear? Or is there anything she could do to bring more clarity to what she wrote? And then you're going to reverse, and Maria, you'll read one of yours to Carrie exactly the way you wrote it. What's the name, what's the description? And Carrie, you'll give Maria feedback. So is that pretty clear, or is there anything she could do to add more clarity to what she wrote? Everybody clear on that? Let's do that right now. So as you did that, as you were thinking of behaviors, what did you find? Was it difficult to think of behaviors? Was it easy to think of behaviors? What you done?
A little difficult.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
I found it easier when you said, what drives you crazy?
Yeah.
Yeah, because,
Yeah.
what am I always wanting more of
Yeah.
that I'm not quite getting?
I mean, most people, in my experience, find it's not easy to articulate them clearly. But most people, I know what drives me nuts or what stuff I want to see more of. I can think of that stuff. For many people, they find it kind of liberating to let go of these vague values discussions. Yeah, I know what I want to have happen. Again, writing the descriptions, yeah, it takes more than 5 minutes to do. You only have 2 minutes. So crafting that in a really clear, articulate way isn't always easy. So who's willing to share one that you came up with? Go ahead. Yeah, Jim?
I put take pride in preparation, warrant instruction, so I put study the plans, have a plan, ask questions if needed, communicate to your team, and make sure you have everything you need to execute the plan.
Beautiful, love it, excellent. Yeah, it's a very clear action. You described what you want, really good. Yeah, excellent. Thank you, Karen.
I wrote work with a sense of urgency. So deliver the videos in advance of the customer's deadline, move quickly, and for our editors, use the most efficient quick keys.
Yeah.
That's
So,
super specific, but.
well, yeah, I like it. So the only thing I would suggest there, I like work with sense of urgency. Yeah, it's real important. We generally should be able, have always been able, to write behaviors that are universal across the organization, but we teach them to people in a way that's context specific or relevant for their role. So the principle is to work with sense of urgency. When I'm talking to an editor, it might mean one thing. When I'm talking to the receptionist, it might mean something else. But it's the sense of urgency. So I would just try to keep my description a little broader than those specific things. But when I'm teaching it to people, then I'm mentioning those kinds of things. Okay? Who else got one you're willing to share? Joe, thanks for volunteering.
Constructive problem solving, ask enough questions, non-biased, avoid judgment, discuss challenges and options, explore impossibilities, ask why and why not.
Yeah, so my only suggestion there is just your title. This sounds a little picky. So when you say what would you call it? Constructive?
I started with positive problem solving.
Yeah, and that's, I'm okay with either one, but constructive or positive problem solving is a thing. solve problems constructively or positively is an action. Do you see the difference between the two? And this sounds really picky, but it's important that every title should itself be an action just because it's more powerfully stated that way. If I say problem solving, yeah, I'm in favor of problem solving. It's a good thing. I don't have to do anything about it, but I like the idea. If you say solve problems in a certain way, it's like, boom, it just speaks to me as it's an action. So just make every title itself an action. Claire, go ahead and volunteer. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I said something, but I don't think you're going to like the title.
That's all right. That's why we're doing it.
It's something I get from my husband,
Okay.
which is never say never.
Okay. That's an action.
Okay. When a customer asks if we can do something, share the request. We have channels to share in our team, so we can see how we can do it, rather than assuming that we can't.
Yeah. I'm generally fine with that. It's similar to if you look at my number.
I'm sure I looked at yours.
Yeah, look at my number 11.
Find a way.
Yeah. And I say specifically in there, rather than explaining why we can't do it, start with how we can do it.
I'll give that to my husband for Valentine's Day.
Yes. So yeah, as a general comment, most of the time, not always, but most of the time, I would rather you describe things in positive terms. Give people a picture to live into. What do you want them to do? Find a way as something to do. Never say never as something to avoid. So most of the time, it's better to describe what you want so that you give people a picture to do. I say most of the time because there are some rare times where the negative may be clearer or more direct, and I'm okay with that. So I have a client in Texas, it's a food manufacturing company, and we have a behavior we teach there that's called never compromise on food safety. I think it's a stronger statement in the negative than if we tried to turn it into a positive. Or I have actually a law firm client in Arizona that has one that we call don't be a jerk. And it's kind of a strong statement, but it was their way of saying that you can advocate forcefully for your client without having to be a jerk, that we don't have to be condescending and unprofessional. So it was kind of powerful in the way that it was written. So there are some rare times where the negative may be a little clearer and stronger and more powerful, but the vast majority of the times, better to describe what you want people to do than things you don't want them to do. How about a couple more examples? Doug, go ahead.
Work in a safe fashion.
Okay.
Look for unsafe conditions and fix them before you have a chance to be heard.
Yeah, cool. Yep, comes up a lot. Ryan, you got one?
Always take ownership of what you do.
Okay.
When doing any task or project, see it all the way through and put your name on it.
Yeah, good. Excellent. So you're getting the hang of these. So some general suggestions. First of all, as I said, make sure that every title is itself an action. When you're writing a description, a good way to think of a description is that every description should answer the question, what do you want people to do? Sometimes I hear or read descriptions that are very philosophical, spouting off about all the things I believe. That's nice, but what do you want people to do? These are actions. So everyone should answer the question, what do you want people to do? When you're thinking about writing a specific description, it is often helpful to picture, do you have anybody in your organization who's really good at this? So you were talking about working with a sense of urgency. Is there anybody in your whole organization that you think is like God's gift to urgency? Oh yeah, Mary, she's just incredible. Well, what does Mary do that makes you say that? Oh, you should see her. She does blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, that's a pretty good description. Sometimes picturing a real person who's good at this is an easy way for you to visualize how to describe it, versus, again, it just being an abstract idea. If you have nobody in your company who's good at this, well, imagine you hired somebody tomorrow and you were saying, oh, I'm so glad we got them because they're God's gift to that principle. Okay, well, what would they be doing that would cause you to say that? Picture real people. The more clearly you can describe it, the easier it's going to be to teach, coach, guide, give people feedback about. As you're writing behaviors, we're trying to design, I said before this is a design function, we're trying to describe or design the extraordinary company we want to build. Assuming that you already have a pretty good company, it probably borrows heavily, your vision of the future probably borrows heavily from things you are today. There may be things that have helped you to get to where you are now, that have helped you to be so successful that we don't ever want to stop teaching. We want to codify that stuff so we can make sure we teach it. So our vision of the future is likely a combination of things you already do really well today, plus some things we got to get better at. And so it's both. It's our picture of the future. So again, if there are things that have been hallmarks to your success that we need to make sure we always teach, well, let's write that stuff down so we can make sure we're teaching that stuff. Generally speaking, behaviors exist on multiple kinds of levels. On one level is what I call a standard operating procedure, or SOP. Fill out the form in triplicate, make 17 sales calls a week, things like that. Those are important in companies, but that's not a definition of our culture. The level at which we're pitching these, which all of yours were good examples of, is the language I use for this is I call them principle-based behaviors. Honor commitments is a principle, but it's an action. Work with a sense of urgency is a principle, but it's an action. Be prepared, work safely are principles, but they're actions. So we want to pitch it at that level, and all of the examples that you guys gave were pitched at the right level. So we're not so granular as a standard operating procedure. It's higher than that, but these are nonetheless actions. Now, I said to the group yesterday that one of my skills, just a talent I have, is that I happen to be a mind reader. So you want to be very careful what you're thinking. Don't be saying anything bad about the Eagles. And I'm sure that, as most of you, much like Carrie, looked at this card, your first thoughts were probably, hey, these are pretty good, I like these. And then your second thought was, 30 of these? You gotta freaking be kidding me. There's no way that would work in my company. I mean, maybe in yours, that's not working in my company. How many of these should we have? And the answer to that question, without wanting to be flippant about it or evasive, is whatever you got. That the number doesn't really matter. And as I said earlier, I'm going to show you shortly we're going to go to, well, what are we going to do with all this stuff? And when I show you how we're going to use this, you're going to see why the number just doesn't matter. And it's a little bit counterintuitive, because I'm all about keeping things simple. Generally, the less is more. Let's not overcomplicate things. But there's a particular reason in this unique circumstance why the number just doesn't matter. As a data point, having done this, close to 200 times, the least I've ever seen, and what do you think is the least I've ever seen?
10?
18.
20. Actually, you know what? I say 20, but we just had a client that did 18. So before that, it was 20. The most I've ever seen is 40. The typical is between 25 and 30. All of those companies, every one of them at the beginning said, I don't want to have any more than like 5 or 10 because that'll just never work. None of those companies are saying that afterwards. And so I get the concern, but when I show you how we're going to use it, you'll see why the number just doesn't really matter. It's just not something to worry about. What I would also say is if you said you only wanted to have 7, if you looked at my card and said, okay, which 23 of these things do you think aren't important enough to teach? I mean, there might be 1 or 2 that don't resonate for you, but if you had to get rid of 23 of these, it would be really hard. It just turns out, as I said earlier, there's a lot more than 3 or 5 or 7 things that are important to teach people. And it won't matter, as I'll show you. All right. We've spent a lot of time, and we needed to, talking about how to define. Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
You mentioned the survey. You survey your customers on these 23?
These 30.
30?
Yes.
Whatever's there.
Yes. Every year. Yeah.
And do you find that when you, you're talking to groups and customers, do they rehash what you have here, or is it a complete set of new ones every time?
Let me make sure I'm understanding your question. So is your question, when I work with different people, are everybody's behaviors the same? Is that what you're asking?
No, I'm saying do they take a shortcut and reuse what you've already done? I mean, I love it.
The copywritten stuff? That stuff? No. Well, actually, no, to be honest with you, I have written, so I'll answer it this way. I've written about 75 or 80 behaviors that, and all kinds of good ways of writing them. And when I facilitate a process with a company of helping them think of their things, I already know what you're going to come up with. for the most part, because I've seen it all before. And companies aren't that different, which is why Vistage works. I mean, if every company was so unique, you guys couldn't learn from each other. But what it takes for a group of people to come together and perform in extraordinary ways is not dramatically different from company to company. Having said that, when I do this with people, we go through a process to have you think of them, because you will own it more when it came out of you. When you thought of the things that matter to you, even if I know what you're going to come up with, you're going to have greater ownership for it when you thought of it versus me giving you a list and saying, so which one of these do you like? So I think the process is actually important, even though I know what the end result's largely going to be. Yeah.
And when you practice this, do you keep all the numbers the same, or do you reprioritize your numbers of the...
With different clients?
No, with a particular client. So a particular client, do they evolve into prioritizing the things? Or do they refer to them as a reference number at some point?
Well, we keep them in a certain order. The order doesn't matter a lot. And you'll see, this will make sense as I show you what we're about to do with all of this. So the order doesn't matter a lot, but I'm always printing up a card like this. And so if we're going to print it up, we've got to put them in some order. And so generally speaking, I try to front-end load things related to integrity, quality, and service. And back-end load some things that maybe aren't quite as critical, even though the order doesn't really matter a lot. And even when we lay out a card like this, sometimes the order shifts a little bit to make it fit better, because I don't want one to go from the front of the card to the back of the card, from one panel to another. So sometimes 13 becomes 11 and 12 becomes 14, but I never make 23 become number 1. So I try to front-end load things related to quality, integrity, service. In some construction manufacturing fields, we might put a safety one up front, toward the front as well. But the number doesn't matter a lot. Now, we've spent a lot of time talking about how to define really clearly exactly what we want our culture to be. But unless we can get our humans to actually show up and be like this, who the heck cares? It's not worth much. It isn't that much better than all the other stuff everybody's got, unless we can actually operationalize this, get our people to live this way. That's where the rubber meets the road. How are we going to do that? We're going to do that through this concept that I referred to before that I called creating rituals. So here's what I want to do. I want to explain to you what is a ritual. What do I mean by that language? I'm going to share with you some rituals that you're familiar with to help you see why this concept is so important. I'm also going to share with you the story of how I learned about all this crazy stuff, because the story is an interesting story that anchors the concepts and how I took this situation that I found myself in and applied the learning from that to my own company. And then you're going to see how you can apply this in your company, and it's going to all come together and make total and complete sense, even to Karen. I promise. So, what's a ritual? A ritual, the way that I use the language, is some behavior, excuse me, some behavior that we do over and over and over and over again until it becomes baked in. It's just like one of the things, it's just our routine. It's what we do around here. And a simple example of a ritual that you're all familiar with is, think about every time you go to a professional sporting event, or even a collegiate one for that matter, what happens right before the kickoff of every football game, the first pitch of a baseball game, the tip-off of a basketball game, every single time?
Some of the people kneel and some of the people stand up.
Yeah, national anthem, right? Like you don't go to a game and say, I wonder if they could do the national anthem tonight. No, it's just a given. It's not like if they're not running behind schedule, they see if they can squeeze it in, or they don't assign it to somebody, say, Andrew, it's your job to try to remember tonight. No, it's just our routine. It's just what we do. And the reason that's so important, not the national anthem itself, but the idea that it's a ritual, is that if it wasn't baked in as an automatic thing, if it was subject to trying to remember or have enough time, do you think it would happen in every single game? I doubt it. Probably happen at the beginning, and then there'd probably be some time where we were busy and we were running behind schedule. We said, we'll just skip it tonight, we'll do it tomorrow. And then after a while, it would probably figure out, like most things. But it's not left to that. It's just what we do all the time, no matter what. The reason that's so important as a concept is that it's our nature as human beings. It's just the way we're wired. That most human beings, and by extension companies, stink at sticking with things. We're just not that good at it. I mean, I'd be willing to bet that if I was here in the first couple of weeks of January, every gym in the entire Orlando region was probably mobbed. This is the year we're going to get healthy until about the second half of February. Now, Stefan's going to keep this thing going, but the rest of the people, end up by the second half of February, we're not doing it anymore. And this is actually, we all run into this challenge. This is a particular challenge in Vistage. I mean, your people all know when you have a Vistage meeting, right? Because you come back all excited about something, we got to do this, and they know they don't have to take it seriously. Because by next month, you'll have another meeting, you'll probably have forgotten about it. And as CEOs, we actually struggle with this more than most people. What is it about our CEO personalities that makes it more difficult for us than most to stick with things?
ADHD.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Most CEOs have some degree of ADHD. We get distracted easily. We have short attention spans. We get excited about new ideas. We think as soon as we understand it, it's basically done, right? I got it. As soon as it gets to the implementation stage, oh God, it gets so boring and uninteresting. And so as soon as we get to that point, it's like, ugh. And then we read another book or hear, we're going to do this. And then we leave behind us this trail of half-implemented initiatives. Now again, I know this doesn't apply to you, but you recognize other people this applies to. Well, rituals are what help us to stick with things when we wouldn't normally have to do it on our own. It's the ritual that keeps it going. I'll give you a really silly example that I use all the time. It's silly, but I use it because I think it really makes the point clear. How many of you, when you woke up on Monday morning, go back to the beginning of this week, all right? Start of the week. How many of you, when you woke up on Monday morning, said this to yourself? It's a brand new week. This week it's going to be the new me. I mean, I'm turning over a new leaf this week. This week, I'm going to see if I can go every single day, and I mean literally every day, not even missing one, every day, brushing my teeth every morning.
Oh.
So today's Wednesday. How many of you are still on the streak? Nice. You told me this was a high-performing group. So it wasn't you. So how are you able to pull that off?
Parents.
Yeah, it's just part of your routine, right? You wake up in the morning, you go through a set of activities, you probably don't even remember doing it. It's just kind of part of the routine. I was given this example once, and someone said, what age does that start? Because my 9-year-old can't seem to do this. But the point is, for most of us, this isn't a struggle. We don't wake up in the morning and debate, I know I should probably brush my teeth. I just don't feel like it. I mean, I did it yesterday, and my breath might stink. I got the Vistage me. You don't sit there and debate this. You just do it. It's just part of your routine. That's the power of a ritual. When something becomes a ritual, it's no longer difficult to do. It's just part of your routine. So here's what I want you to consider. If there was a way that we could create rituals that were as baked in, as automatic as brushing our teeth or as doing the national anthem, if we could create rituals that were that automatic around how we teach and practice those behaviors we were writing, that'd be a game changer, wouldn't it? Because all of a sudden it would have a chance to last for years and years and years into the future because it wouldn't be dependent upon your discipline and motivation. No, it's the ritual that would keep it going, not you. See, this is a topic I tell people all the time that you can't overpower or out-muscle with discipline and motivation. You can't say to yourself, you know what, I know we're not usually good at sticking with stuff, but that stuff frequent told us is really important and this time I'm going to make it stick. No, you're not. Let's be honest. Even with the best of intentions, you're going to go back to work, hopefully, and stuff's going to happen. You're going to get a big new customer or lose a customer or have some key employee leave or whatever, and stuff's going to get in the way. And it's going to eventually fall by the wayside, unless you build rituals. If you're smart, you don't think you're going to somehow show up with a level of discipline you've never shown before. Instead, you build rituals and you let the rituals do the work instead of you. Does that make sense conceptually? And I'm going to show you how to do that. Now, the story of how I learned about all this is an interesting story. It's a Ritz-Carlton story, and the story goes back 15 years to 2003. My company was always known for extraordinary customer service. We were really, really good at that game. And I was always pushing the envelope of how we could be better. It's just a hot button for me. And I was thinking about it a lot back then, as I always do, and I had this idea that I wanted to plan some sort of an activity where I could take our staff off-site and do something to get us to think bigger about amazing customer service. And so what I did, is I closed the office at noon. It was a Friday in December of that year, I remember this. And I closed the office at noon, and I didn't tell people what we were gonna do. And what I did is I chartered a couple of buses. And these buses pulled up to my office in southern New Jersey, and everybody came out of the office, climbed aboard the buses, wondering, like, where are we going? And what we did is we drove from my office over to Center City, Philadelphia, which was just like a 20 or 25-minute drive. And we went to the Ritz-Carlton. And my plan was that we would have lunch at the Ritz-Carlton, and then we would spend the afternoon in a meeting room doing some brainstorming about amazing, fabulous, incredible customer service experiences. And as you're no doubt figuring out, the reason I chose to go there is I wanted to be in the environment to soak up Ritz-Carlton-ness, if there was such a word as that. And I figured if you go to the La Quinta Inn, you think La Quinta Inn level thoughts. You go to Ritz-Carlton, you think like a Ritz-Carlton. So I want to be in the right environment to think like this. At the time that I did this, I didn't know a lot about Ritz-Carlton. I just knew that they had this reputation for amazing service. But I suspected, though I didn't know, it couldn't have been by accident. It couldn't be, you know, they just seemed to hire nice people. It all worked out okay. There had to be more to it than that for them to be so consistent. So I called them, and I explained to them why we were coming for the day. And I asked them, I said, do you think you could have someone come during lunch and maybe spend 20, 25 minutes with us, sharing with us some of the behind-the-scenes practices that enable you guys to be so consistent? And they being a Ritz-Carlton, of course, what do you think they said?
Call this 1-800 number.
Not there. They said, it would be our pleasure. They're very particular about their language. They did not say, uh-huh, nor did they say, no problem, which I hate. They said, it would be our pleasure. Anyway, they had a woman from their HR department come, and she spent about 25 minutes with us, and she told us about 2 things that day that I would not be exaggerating if I told you that the 2 things I learned that day were to change the course of the rest of my career. Little did I know that was going to happen. The first thing that I learned about is something that's known as the Ritz-Carlton Basics. Anybody ever heard of the Ritz-Carlton Basics? You'll find this interesting. So Ritz-Carlton has 20 behaviors they teach. Strangely enough, they didn't think that was too many. And these behaviors are known as their basics. And these are actually more granular kinds of things, a little more standard operating procedures than mine. But there's 20 of them, and they're numbered 1 through 20, and they have them on this laminated card. That's actually where I got the idea for the cards. And these are simple things, like if you were at a Ritz-Carlton and you asked, where's the women's room? They'd never say, go down the hall, you turn left, you'll see it down there on the right. They would escort you back to the women's room, unless you're a man, of course, or identify in some other way. They have a basic that's called noticing and recording guest preferences. If Sunit is at a Ritz-Carlton and he likes his coffee black, somebody's paying attention to that. And they write that down, they put it in their computer system. And the next time Sunit's at a Ritz-Carlton, everybody knows you gotta give him his coffee black, that's the way he likes it. They pay attention to this stuff. So they have these 20 different behaviors, numbered 1 through 20, and these are called their basics. I thought that was pretty interesting, but the much more interesting thing is what they do with all of this. What they do with it is they have a ritual. That's my word, they don't use that word. Their ritual is called the daily lineup. And here's what happens. Every single day, in every department, in every shift, in every Ritz-Carlton property in the world, the team members get together at the beginning of the shift. And they gather around, they have this 10 or 12-minute meeting, it's called the daily lineup. And the first thing that happens in their daily lineup each day is they spend the first few minutes talking about the basic of the day. So remember I said there's 20 of them. So if this were the Ritz-Carlton property and we were on day number 1, all day long today, in every department, every shift, team members would be getting together at the beginning of the shift, and they'd gather around, they'd have this brief meeting, and they would kick it off talking about basic number 1. How do we practice it? Did it just come up with a guest yesterday? Just a little discussion about it. And then the rest of the meeting is whatever is relevant in that particular department. This is the housekeeping department, we got new sheets in, or the catering department, we got a big party going on, whatever's relevant. But it begins with a brief discussion of today's basic. Tomorrow, all through the property, every department, every shift, everybody's getting together and they start their meeting talking about basic number 2. The day after that, they all get together and they talk about basic number 3 and 4 and so on through 20 days. And at the end of 20 days, what do you think they do? Go back to the beginning. And they do it over and over and over and over again every single day of their entire career. Think about that. In a given property, this may happen 30 or 40 times a day. given all the different departments and all the different shifts. And think about the diversity of a Ritz-Carlton workforce. We think we have challenging workforces. They've got landscapers and dishwashers and front desk people and bellhops and banquet salespeople and corporate execs and people at so many different levels. And they drive this extraordinarily consistent culture through that diverse a workforce, because every single day, every single one of them is in a daily lineup, and they're all talking about the same basic. That's what consistency looks like. And by the way, if today's day number 11, it's day number 11 in every Ritz-Carlton property in the world today. They've got nearly 40,000 employees in more than 30 different countries and more than 150 different properties. And today, on February the 14th, every one of their nearly 40,000 employees is in a daily lineup, and they're all talking about the same basic. And this actually includes the corporate headquarters. This sounds kind of hokey, but it's very real. Again, I was there. The corporate headquarters is in this office building, at least when I was there. It's a 2-story atrium building. And every morning at 9 o'clock, everybody gets out of their office, and they gather around the atrium, and they go through daily lineup. And you don't take a phone call at 8:58, because that's what we do. At 9 o'clock, that's what we do. It's very real for them. I'll share one really quick story about this. I was sharing this story once with a Vistage group. I think I was in Atlanta. And there was a guy in the group who told his own Ritz-Carlton story. I thought it was such a great story that I've stolen it, and I'll share it with you guys. The story this guy told me is he said he was at a Ritz-Carlton once, and he hadn't known about all this. And he was in the bar. And he's sitting in the bar, and he's noticing across the room, the bartender, this guy is amazing. He is so over the top, friendly and helpful and enthusiastic and gregarious, even more than you would expect to see in a place like a Ritz-Carlton. And it made my guy curious to know, like, what's going on with that guy? Is he on drugs, or what's the story? So he wanted to find out more, so he waited till the crowd thinned out a little bit, and he walked up to the bartender, Stephanie, the bartender. And he went up to the bartender, and he said, I gotta tell you, I'm amazed. I mean, I've been sitting over there across the room, and I've been watching you. I'm impressed. I mean, I've never seen anybody like you. What's that about? The bartender pulls out of his pocket the card with the Ritz-Carlton basics and explains to my guy all about the daily lineup and the basics and how they do this. And my guy was amazed because he had never heard this before, and he asked the bartender an interesting question. And the bartender's answer to the question is the point I want to share the story. So here's what he asked him. He said, that's pretty cool. I mean, that's impressive. But come on, be honest with me. I mean, just between us guys, does everybody really do this? I mean, do you have to do this? And here's what the bartender's answer was. He said, only if I want to work here. That's what great organizations are like. There's a way that we do things around here. And if that doesn't work for you, that's okay. You can work somewhere else. Every championship sports team is like that, isn't it? There's a way that we do things on this team. And that's how we roll. And if that doesn't work for you, you could probably go to some other team. In lesser companies, well, what if he's a big salesperson? I can't say anything about that. Great companies, no, there's a way we do things. Anyway, I heard all that day back in 2003, and it really struck a chord in me. And it got me thinking, that's interesting. Why does that work so well? Like, what's going on in the human behavior that makes what they're doing so powerful? And more importantly, how can I apply that in my company? I'm not a hotel, I'm just an insurance agency. But there are universal principles at play here that if I could figure out how to apply could be pretty powerful. So I went home literally that weekend and began to think, okay, if I had basics, what would my basics be? And over the course of a weekend, I wrote this initial card. My company was called RSI. This is a collector's item. This is worth a lot of money. So my company was called RSI, and I wrote this card. There's actually 30 of them in my first version. It's just the way it worked out. And I wrote this over a weekend. I sent it out to my leadership team just to say, is there anything I'm missing? Anything I should add, subtract? If I remember right, I think I played with it for 2 or 3 weeks until I said, okay, this is it. This is going to be our stuff. One of the first decisions I made is I thought these needed a name. Ritz-Carlton had basics, and it would sound weird to say we're on behavior 11. No, you need a name. And so I thought, you know what? These are fundamental to our success. I know. I'll call these our fundamentals. And that's what I call these fundamentals. So these are examples of just lots of companies all over the country, there's only about half of them, who practice fundamentals. It's just the name that I made up for behavior. So when you hear me say fundamental, think of behavior. Ritz-Carlton has basics, I've got fundamentals. So now I have my fundamentals, that's great, but what about that daily lineup? I mean, that's really where the power in all of this is. Well, the first decision I made is, I don't have departments and shifts like a hotel has. I'm an office environment. I don't know that would fly in my environment. So then I thought, well, what if I took one of these every month and we focused on it throughout the month? And then I thought, is that going to do anything? If we talked about it today and it was 30 days before we did anything else, is that really going to have any impact? Probably not. So then I thought, what if I take one of these every week? Which is what I ultimately did. Is I said the first week we're going to focus on fundamental number 1 all week long. We're going to do a series of different activities, which I'll share in a moment, for how we're going to practice, talk about, explore, tune up our awareness, really work on this fundamental all week long. The following week, the whole company is going to focus on fundamental number 2, and the next week number 3, the next week number 4, and so on. I happen to have 30 of them, so at the end of 30 weeks we go back to the beginning and we do it over and over and over again every week for the rest of our lives. Because that's how it starts to sink in. So what did we do every week to really focus on our fundamental? Well, there were 2 rituals that I created initially when I started all of this years ago, and pretty much every one of our clients does these 2, and then there's a 3rd one that I added about 3 years ago that we also do. So the first ritual I created when I started this is I said, here's what we're gonna do. From now on, every Monday morning for the first round, the first 30 weeks, every Monday morning I would send out a voicemail and an email to my entire organization with this week's fundamental and a brief lesson that I want to teach about it. What does it mean? How do we practice this? Did it just come up with a customer yesterday? Just a little bit of teaching. And my teaching would be like a couple of paragraphs. It's not a 30-page thesis, but it's just my chance to teach about this principle and why it's important to us. And I did it in voicemail and email because some would rather read, some would rather listen. So whatever format you like, you get it in both. So every week, for 30 weeks in a row, I would send this message out. When we got to the end of 30 and we're back to number 1, I went to my senior leadership team. I had about 10 senior leaders. I said, all right, here's what we're going to do. Stephanie, you got week number 1. Michelle, you got 2. Lee's got 3. Claire's got 4, and so on. And for the next 30 weeks, each member of my leadership team would take a week, and they would author what the message of the week was and what it meant to them. Because as you might imagine, I wanted this to cascade through the organization and not just be the David Friedman story. Did that for 30 weeks, 1 round. When we finished that, we're at 60 weeks. That's more than a year, which is pretty good staying power. What do you think we did next? Keep on going. We're fairly flat, so that meant our regular employees. We put a sign-up sheet in our kitchen. And we asked our regular folks to sign up for a week that they wanted to be the author of this week's message from their peers. And this went on every single week. So for the next dozen years, every week a message would go out. It could be from my bookkeeper. It could be from the receptionist. It could be from a salesperson with this week's fundamental and what it means to them. And I watch this in my company. I watch it in all of our clients. I watch the level of ownership shift as it works its way through the organization. I may be here at call 1 and read what Stefan has to say. I think, you know what, he makes a good point. I like that. But when I have to talk about it myself, I own it in a distinctly different and much more powerful way. It's fascinating to watch. You know, many of our clients share with me, because they all do this, many of our clients share with me some of the emails that their employees send. Consistently, the employees put more effort into it than the leaders do. This is their chance to shine in front of their peers. They take it seriously. This is their chance. They want to say something meaningful. And they just own it in a very big way. It's fascinating to watch. Yeah?
I love that idea.
Mm-hmm.
What do you do with the people? I mean, they're probably gone, but I think this is what puts me. Well, it doesn't put me off exactly,
sure.
but you always get the little so and so that's going. Oh, what does she know? Oh, well, she would say that, wouldn't she? It's her company, you know.
Uh-huh.
And I gradually over the years, I've taken those people off my team.
Yeah.
But now I'm growing a bigger team, and I think, you know, you want everyone smiling back at you, don't you?
Yes,
you want
you do.
everyone, you know, you want everyone going, yeah, that's great.
Yes.
And there's always someone going, yeah. Well.
You know, it's interesting. You get surprisingly little of that.
Right.
And you're right, you know, you weed those people out, but you get very, very little. And a lot of it is because we haven't really talked about how we roll it out, but it gets rolled out in very interactive sessions with all the employees, which sets the table for success.
Right.
And my experience is that most good people want to talk about stuff like this. I mean, everything we're talking about are things that normal human beings would think are good. Like, which employee is going to say, well, wait a second, why do I have to honor my commitments? I don't think I should have to do that. Or, you know, we need more blame in this company. If we could have more blame, this would be a better. I mean, these are things that are so basic to human nature that any normal person would say, yeah, I want to be in a place like that. Now, they may have some doubt about whether it's really going to last, but we'll prove that with time. But they want it. And if they don't, you don't want them in your company. Yeah, Jacob.
When you started letting your employees write it, your voicemail, did you screen it before it went
Yeah,
out?
good question. No. And there's
What
no,
if
there's,
it's the market?
yeah, there's no right or wrong about this. So there are some people who do. I don't. So what I do, there's a delicate balance here, as you're recognizing, between, on the one hand, I want them to own it. On the other hand, what if they say something it's like, what the hell were they thinking? And so I wanted to, for me, I err on the side of their ownership. But I do a few things to hedge my bet. And so there were 3 things I did to hedge my bet. First thing I did is that I have a Word document where I have all of my original emails copied and pasted into one Word document, and I would give it to people when they signed up for a new round of 30. I would give it to them, and so at least when they get ready to write, if they read what I wrote and that's in their head, they're more likely to be on message. Second thing I did is when it was time for a new round of 30, I would gather the people around who had signed up, and I would just do a brief 20-minute teaching about here's some good tips and ideas and suggestions on how to do this well. So it just gives a better chance. Third thing I did is that about every 3 or 4 years, I would take a new round of 30 myself. And I thought of it as kind of my way of truing us up back to center. It's sort of like, the old telephone game where you whisper down the lane, and by the time it gets too far, the message gets very different from how it started. Well, there can start to be a little bit of drift. And hey, I wrote these. I know what I meant by them. And so if every few years I take a new round of 30, it's like, let's get us back centered up again. So I did those things to kind of hedge my bet. But other than that, I let them write whatever they write. And I've very, very rarely seen something I think, oh, terrible. Once in a while, I think, yeah, they were kind of mailing it in. It wasn't particularly insightful. But most of the time, they were actually really good. But I'd rather err on the side of allowing them to do that. So that's the first ritual we did. The second ritual, which was going on at the same time, so this isn't later, this is at the same time, is I said, all right, here's what we're going to do. From now on, every time we have a meeting in our company, whether it's a management meeting, a project team meeting, a customer meeting, a department meeting, if there's a meeting going on in our company this week, every single one of those meetings, the first agenda item of the meeting is the fundamental of the week. And we spend the first 3 to 5 minutes talking about this week's fundamental. So what that would look like is, in my company, our fundamental this week happens to be something that I call deliver results. And it's about focusing on the result versus the effort. Like so many people love to talk about, how many calls they made, how many attempts they made, how many emails, as if that was the goal. And I don't ever want to lose sight of the fact, at the end of the day, we get paid to get the job done, to make the sale, to solve the problem, whatever. So it's an emphasis on results. So if we were kicking off this meeting, I would start by saying, hey, so this week we're on deliver results, and I would call on some people to get them involved. I might say, Claire, do you think there are ever times where it's just good enough to put in a good effort? Or, sooner, what gets in the way of sometimes delivering the results? Or how could we be better about that? And then we get a conversation going. And this is where the teaching is taking place. Because no matter how beautifully we tried to write this, we're never going to write 3 or 4 sentences that explain everything you ever need to know about it. That's not going to happen. These only exist in the context of real life. When somebody says, you know what, that sounds good on paper, but how do you do it with this pain in the butt customer? You can't ever do it with those guys. Really? So what do you do? Now we have a discussion going. This is where the gray areas and the nuances and the subtleties come out. When somebody says, it says here to do what's best for the client. Does that mean anything they want we should do? Or are there some boundaries around that? Well, let's talk about that. That's where the stuff starts to live. So depending upon your role, you could be in 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8 different meetings this week, and in every single one of them, we're going to kick it off talking about the fundamental of the week. One of the ways that I think about that ritual is it's sort of like the analogy I sometimes use, is I think about, in the legal profession, we have this distinction between the statute, the written law, and what's often called case law. So all over the United States, court cases come up and judges make opinions, and that forms the body of how to interpret the law. I kind of think of it in an almost analogous way. This is the statute, and those discussions that are taking place all week long are the case law. That's how we apply this stuff to real situations. What that ritual also does is it helps our teaching shift from being what I call episodic to what I call systematic. And what I mean by that is episodic is The only chance I get to talk about, honoring commitments is when somebody didn't. There was an episode and I get to say, hey, remember, we got to honor our commitments. But what if it didn't come up this week? When do I teach it? By creating these multiple opportunities through the meetings to talk about the fundamental of the week, I'm creating lots of chances in a more systematic way to talk about that principle. I don't have to wait till there's a problem. We're going to talk about it in every single meeting. So I've shifted the teaching from, again, being what I call episodic to what I call systematic. So that's the second ritual we do. And pretty much all of our clients do that too. There's a third ritual that I started about 3 years ago. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just ask a question
Absolutely.
about that one?
Sure.
So you're in a project meeting,
Mhm.
you got a million things to do.
Yeah.
That sounds like you need a facilitator of some kind, like the leader has to start that and make sure it gets done. Is that
Yeah.
right? Like,
Yes. So it just becomes a routine. That's just what we do. So typically I suggest at the beginning, when we first roll this out, that the leader of the meeting be responsible for starting that discussion. And again, you keep it to no more than 5 minutes and you move on. You don't want to take over the meeting. Over time, it's great to start to pass the facilitation of that to other people. So you say, hey, Mark, at next week's meeting, I'd love it if you would lead the discussion of our fundamental of the week. And then you really start to get even more participation because you have other people lead it. But at the beginning, when it's new, it's good to have the leader do it. When people sometimes, one of my experiences is when I talk to somebody who's been practicing their fundamentals and they're new, sometimes they say, we're pretty good in our meetings, but sometimes we forget. So what can we do to be better? So a couple easy suggestions. Ideally, every meeting should have a written agenda. So you create a template for your agenda, and the first item on the template is fundamental of the week. Do that, and you'll remember to do it. Here's another thing you can do. This is sort of a silly thing, but it actually works. And I've suggested this to many, that you make a little rule and you say, if we start a meeting and we forget to talk about our fundamental of the week, that the leader of the meeting owes everybody else in the meeting $1. Do that once or twice and you'll remember. So it's a silly thing, but it works. And then it just becomes your routine. It's sort of like if you were to ask at Ritz-Carlton, is it hard to remember to do your daily lineup? They'd say, what? No, it's just what we do. It's just how we operate. It just becomes baked into what we do. There's a third ritual that I created about 3 years ago. And it's based on a proprietary software tool that's called eMinder. The way it works is every Wednesday morning, it emails to all the employees in a company what I call a scenario-based lesson related to the fundamental of the week. So what that means in English is it sends them some situation that has to do with this week's fundamental, and it asks them, what would you do if you were faced with this? So now the employee has to actually think about it and apply it to a real situation. It's multiple choice, so it's not hard. It gives them 4 choices, A, B, C, D. The employee reads it and they think, I think D. And they hit submit, and as soon as they hit the submit button, they immediately get a feedback email that gives them coaching. And the answer, the feedback they get is different if you answer A versus B versus C versus D. It will either say, yes, that's a great answer for this reason, or no, that was a good try, but here's what you really want to do. So it forces everybody to engage with the fundamental of the week, apply it to a real situation, and get some learning.
What's this called?
Yeah, it's called eMinder.
Okay.
If the employee doesn't answer it on Wednesday, they get a reminder on Thursday. And if they don't answer it on Thursday, they get a final reminder Friday. And at the end of the week, the leadership team can run reports by person, department, and location in any date range to see who's answering and who's not. So, shoot, you could do a performance review with somebody and see how engaged they are in your culture. But it's all automated, so it's easy to do. So that's a third ritual that pretty much all of our people do. So this is what I mean by rituals. So, and by the way, this is not a new concept. What do you think religions do? They don't say, if you get a bit of free time, see if you can pray once in a while. They say, here's the deal. If you're Christian, you go to church on Sunday, maybe some other days. If you're Jewish, you go to the synagogue on Saturday, and maybe some other days. And when you're there, you do rituals, right? This isn't anything new. And anybody that's ever been part of a Bible study or a Torah reading for Jews, what's that about? You get together at the same time of the week with some friends and you look at a section of the Bible and you see how it applies in your life, and the next week you do the next section, and you go back to the beginning. This isn't anything unusual. We've known about this forever. We just forgot about it as it relates to our companies. Now, if you were in my company, you would be crystal clear about our culture. I mean, that's our culture. There's no confusion about it. You would have been you would have been selected because you're a really good fit for that culture, and everybody around you would be a similar good fit. You would have gone through an integration program that literally blew your brain. It was like nothing you'd ever experienced before. Everywhere you looked, you'd see the fundamentals. We had these beautifully framed poster prints of our 30 fundamentals, and then lined our walls. We had mouse pads with our fundamentals. We had screensavers with our fundamentals. The fundamental of the week was posted in the reception area and all the managers' offices. You'd see it everywhere. Your managers would always use the language of the fundamentals in their coaching. We did annual fundamentals training that everybody had to go through. The fundamentals were in our performance reviews. The leaders are good examples of the fundamentals. We did the annual survey that I was telling you about to hold ourselves accountable to it. And in addition to all of that, every single week you'd get a message from one of your peers with this week's fundamental and what it meant to them. You'd be in multiple meetings this week and you'd be talking about the fundamental in every single meeting. And you'd engage in a lesson to apply the fundamental to a real situation, and you would do that week after week after week after week after week of your whole career. What do you think starts to happen after a while? It becomes internalized, becomes institutionalized. You work here, it's just the way we do things. It's not that complicated. Now, I want to share with you two very important things that I've learned about rituals. And then I'm going to show you one other illustration and then tie this all together. So, first thing I've learned that's very important about rituals is the power in what I call a cyclical ritual. What do you think I mean by a cyclical ritual? Think about what Ritz-Carlton did when I did. What's a cyclical ritual?
Same thing comes back around.
Yeah, it comes back around. So it's where we have a finite list of items and we go through them in order, and at the end of the list we go back to the beginning and we do it over and over again. So brushing our teeth is a ritual, but it's not a cyclical ritual. The national anthem is a ritual, but it's not a cyclical ritual. The way Ritz-Carlton does their 20 basics in a row and back to the beginning, the way I do my fundamentals back to the beginning, that I call a cyclical ritual. The reason cyclical rituals are so important really goes to how we learn as human beings. You see, if we were like the normal company, we said, okay, folks, here's our 6 core values, or 7. Do these 7 things. I think that's too much to think about. But if instead I say, this week, we're going to focus on just one idea. All week long, we're going to talk about it, we're going to think about it, we're going to discuss it, we're going to tune up our words, we're going to practice it. All week long, we're going to focus on this one idea. Do you think I'm going to learn it better if I do that? Of course I am. And next week, we're going to do number 2, and the next week, number 3 and 4, and so on. So we get the best of both worlds. We get the increased learning and penetration that comes from focusing on only one thing at a time, but we get all of them because we're going to keep cycling through them over and over. And this is why I said earlier that the number doesn't really matter. Because whether you have 7 or 11 or 16 or 27, we're only going to do one at a time anyway. And we're going to do it every week for the rest of your life. So what difference does it make how many we have? Outside of something extreme, if we had 472 of them, we'd never get back to the beginning. But outside of something silly, it just doesn't really matter. And we're not going to our people saying, can you recite number 16? Or can you memorize the little catchy phrase? No, I don't need that. I just know that if we talk about this stuff every single week, sooner or later it's going to live in people. That's why the number doesn't matter. Does that make sense? It just doesn't. Yeah.
What about interruptions in rituals? I mean, one of the roadblocks I can see, well, I work in 3 time zones anyway, that's one little hurdle, but assuming I could get everybody in one time zone, like Eastern Standard Time, which is the one I like, what about if they say, well, I've got to be here, or I've got this going on? How do you overcome that? I mean, I know I can see how, but how do you overcome that?
So let me describe the second thing I've learned because it will relate to that. So the second thing I've learned about rituals is to the extent that you can leverage or take advantage of rituals that already exist in your company, this is easier to do. Notice in my company, I did not say, let's start a new meeting where we could all talk about the fundamental. Because what would people have said if I did? Who's got time for that? Instead, I said, this is easy. Let's just take a few minutes of the meeting. You're already in. This doesn't take any extra time. You're already there. We'll just take a few minutes and talk about the fundamental. You already have rituals in your company. You may not call them that, but you've got a cadence to every Thursday is our sales meeting. Every Tuesday we do a management meeting. Some of you guys do safety rituals or or daily lineups and things. So to your question, Claire, I'm not suggesting that we start something new. Just whenever there happens to be a meeting, we always start it with the fundamental of the week. Just leverage what already is there. Any of you guys that are in construction and manufacturing, do you guys do safety rituals? What do you do for safety rituals?
Toolbox meetings.
And what's the frequency of those?
Every morning.
Yeah. I see a lot of companies that and is it hard to remember to do that?
No.
It's a ritual, right? You don't have to be disciplined about it. It's just what we do every day. That's the power of a ritual. And if I were to take that, because it's such a great example, I see so many companies that do that. If I were to take that, if I were to compare two companies, Chris is where every single day they're talking about safety, and another company that puts a sign on the wall that says, be safe, which one's more likely to have a better safety record? I'm guessing Chris's. Well, the same is true of our culture. We could put our vision, mission, values on the wall, or we could talk about it every single day. We're more likely to live it if we're talking about it. Taking that a step further, if I was in Chris's company and every single day we're talking about safety, and I go home tonight and I open the front door to my house and I walk in the steps, and on the front steps are my kids' toys, what do you think I'm going to do? I'm going to dress them in some way, right? After I get past the fact that my kids are 25 and 27, the toys shouldn't come front steps. Safety is so drilled into my brain that I'd be willing to bet Chris's people walk around life and there's something on the sidewalk, be careful about that. Oh, watch out for that ladder. They can't help it, it's just in their brain. Well, the same thing happens with fundamentals. If we're talking about our fundamentals every single day, after a while we walk around life and we see life through the lens of honor commitments, practice blameless problem solving, get clear on expectations, be a fanatic about response time, do what's best for the client. It just becomes how you look at the world. And that's the whole goal, is for this to be institutionalized, to become part of how we think. That's the whole point. If I was in your company, I would take my safety rituals, my toolbox talk, and maybe every Monday in your toolbox talk, add 5 minutes to it to talk about the fundamental of the week. You already have the ritual built in. No need to try to create new things. The more new things we create, the more impediments there are to success. Leverage what already exists. Right? Yeah.
Have you had any experience, if you're trying to accelerate getting this culture built, to do the fundamental, like if you had 30 fundamentals, you do a different one each day versus waiting 30 weeks to get?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of all the clients I've ever worked with, which is close to 200, I have 2 of them that do it daily and everybody else weekly. I think daily can work in some environments. So it really is up to you. I don't think I think less than weekly is ineffective. So it shouldn't be spread out more than that. I've got a grocery store chain in Wisconsin with 34 grocery stores, and they just have a setup because they have daily meetings in all their different departments that it just flows naturally, sort of like Ritz-Carlton to do them daily. And I have one other company that does it daily. Everybody else does it weekly. So I think if it can work in your environment, I think it's a good thing. But a lot of environments, it really wouldn't work as well. So I'm fine with either one. But less than weekly, I think, loses its effectiveness. Okay. Now, I'm going to actually throw out one. I'm going to give them a bonus idea, right? I'm not going to charge an extra for this. This is just pure bonus.
They're special.
All right. So this is a family idea. And I'm going to tie this actually back to business. My kids are actually 25 and 27. They're doing great, and I'm really proud of them. But if I could do this all over again, knowing what I know now, which my wife would probably like, if our kids were little again, here's what I would do differently. When my kids were little, like 3, 4, 5 years old, my wife and I would sit down and we would develop a set of family fundamentals. I've actually done this with a few CEOs. And let's, how do we want our family to be? And let's just suppose, to simplify, there were 10 of them. We would create a weekly ritual. And the weekly ritual might look like this. We might take our dinner time conversation every Sunday night, and we would make the dinner time conversation the family fundamental of the week. And we would each talk about how we're going to practice this week's fundamental in our upcoming activities. Now, the conversation would change over time to stay age appropriate. At one age, it's, how could my daughter do this in her brownie troop, and my son in the middle school track team or whatever, and I'm talking about how I'm going to do it in my activities, and my wife and hers. And the conversation, so we'd have to stay relevant, and we would do this every single week. And if we were to do that every single week from the time they were 3, 4, 5 years old till they were, let's say, 18, getting ready to go to college, notwithstanding the fact that for about 3 years in the middle, they would roll their eyes, think it's the stupidest thing we've ever done because they're teenagers, but we would keep doing it. wouldn't it be almost impossible for them to get to be 18 years old and not have internalized the things that my wife and I think are important? Isn't that what we want for our kids? And chances are they would do that for their kids someday as well, I'd be willing to bet. Well, that's just a darn good idea. But if you could understand that it would be almost impossible for them to be in our family and not eventually internalize that, wouldn't the same be true at work? That if we were to define the behaviors that really drive success and we're really clear about them, and we had a structured, systematic way to teach to people over and over and over and over and over and over again, wouldn't it be almost impossible to be in our company and not eventually internalize that? Isn't that all we said we're trying to do? It's not that complicated. Now I want to show you one last illustration that distills everything we've talked about into one simple illustration, and then I'm going to wrap this up. So here's my distilling of the entire morning with the one shot. If you want to internalize, you want to learn something so completely, so totally that you've internalized it, whether we're talking about you want to learn to play the guitar, or you want to learn to speak another language, or be a master cabinet maker, or anything you want to get really good at, what's the key to being able to master something? What do you have to do? Practice. Yeah, tremendous amounts of practice or repetition, right? I could explain to you all day long how to play the guitar, and that's not going to make you a great guitar player. You can read all the books you want about it, and you're not going to be good. The only way you're going to get there is thousands and thousands of hours of working at it, practice and repetition. Everybody agree with that? If we all agree with that, here's the big question for you. How many people do you know who love to do repetition? Not many. There are some. My wife kind of likes repetition. But most people don't. We get bored. So that's kind of a problem. If we've all agreed, maybe we're just being polite, but if we've all agreed that the only way we'll ever master something is through tremendous amounts of repetition, except most people hate repetition, that's kind of a problem. So what's the key to being able to do repetition?
Fun.
Well, I mean, if you can make it fun, I think you get another 6 weeks out of it. But I don't hear a lot of people saying, I was at the game last night when they did the national anthem. Oh God, what a blast that was. What have we just spent the last half hour talking about?
Culture.
No, it just becomes routine.
Rituals,
Yeah.
yes. See, this is what I want you to see. It has to become routine. That rituals are the foundation or the platform or the structure that enable the repetition to keep going. In the absence of it being a ritual, we're going to get bored, distracted, and quit. That's how humans work. When it becomes a ritual, it's no longer difficult to do. Think about brushing our teeth, the national anthem, the fundamental of the week, the basic of the day, the safety rituals. When it becomes a ritual, it's no longer hard to do. That's what keeps the repetition going, and the repetition is what we said is necessary in order to internalize something. So let's apply this very, very directly to your culture. If driving your culture, internalizing the culture, institutionalizing the culture is nothing fancier than getting your people to internalize the behaviors that you said drive success, right? That's all we're trying to do. You know what you want people to do. We just want them to live that. If we want them to internalize those behaviors, they're not going to internalize them simply because you held a big company meeting and announced it to everybody. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do that, but that's not going to be sufficient. They're not going to internalize it because you put posters all over the walls, though I think you should. They're not going to internalize it because you put it in their performance reviews, though I think you should. The only way they're going to internalize it, we've already agreed, is when we teach it to them over and 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 over again. And the only way we'll ever teach it to them with that much repetition is when we create rituals around it, because short of that, we're going to get bored, distracted, and quit. Does that make sense? To me, that's just so ridiculously simple. So let me tie this all back together by bringing us back to where we started this morning. And we started by, I was suggesting to you that all of us exist, nearly all of us at least, exist in commoditized environments where we look a lot like, to at least our prospects, we all look pretty much the same, even if we think we have something that's different. And I suggested to you that when you look at the companies that manage to win in commoditized environments, they don't win because of what they offer. It's not the product or service. That's just a short-term window. They win because of how they go about doing it, how their humans interact with each other, with customers, vendors, how they come together to perform in extraordinary ways. And that if you could somehow pull that off, if you could get your people to be better than your competitors' people, not only would that be the biggest competitive advantage you could create in a commoditized world, but I would argue it's the most sustainable one, because even when your competitors realize that's how you're winning, they're still not likely to be able to pull it off, or it's going to take them years to catch up and do that. I want you to see that working on your culture is not, no disrespect for a few HR people here, working on your culture is not an HR topic. It's not. It's a strategic and financial topic is what it is. We talked about as well, that sort of example with your friends, because I want you to see that, as I said, absent an intentional force on your part, if you're not doing something about it, your culture's getting formed anyway. And it's getting formed mostly influenced by the strongest personalities in your company, for better or worse. And the reason I wanted you to see that is if you understand just how important your culture is to success, that is not something we ought to leave to chance and just hope it's going to work out. Instead, we got to take control of this thing as leaders, and we got to make our culture be what we want it to be, instead of hoping it's going to end up to be whatever it ends up to be. There's a quote that is on the home page of my website, right in the front of it, and it's by a very famous author. His name is Friedman. And the quote says, good companies have good cultures by chance. But world-class companies have world-class cultures by design. And what I mean when I say that is that when I say that good companies have good cultures by chance, what I mean is that my experience is that if you are good leaders, and I have a strong feeling that all of you are naturally going to attract mostly similarly minded people. You're like a magnet. You just pull them in, even if it's not a big strategy. It happens anyway. They like stick to you. And you're going to treat them reasonably well, not because you heard a Vistage speaker say you should treat your people well, or you read a book about it. You wouldn't know how else to do it. You're just being you. And if you just be you, you'll have a decent company. You'll have a decent culture. You're not going to start. You're not going to fail. This is not the difference between success and failure. You're already successful and you haven't been doing this, so how can I claim it is? It's not. It's the difference between being successful and being world-class, because that's a different game. That while good companies have good cultures by chance, world-class companies understand just how important their culture is to success, and they don't leave any of this to chance. Instead, they're incredibly intentional and purposeful and systematic about how they author and create and drive the culture they want to have. None of it is left to chance. And I'm suggesting if you want to be that systematic in your approach, this is one framework you could use to think about how you could be more systematic. And while all 8 of these steps absolutely are important, the reason I draw this the way that I do is these ones around the outer rim in red, I often call these incremental, meaning we could look at how we're doing at selecting the best people to fit our company culture, and we could make incremental improvements to get better at that. And we could look at our integration program, and we could make incremental improvements to that, and so on. But these 2 things in the middle, I don't think are very incremental. If we don't start by defining exactly what we want our culture to be, good luck. I mean, there's nothing else to do. We have to start there. And you know by now, because I've beaten it to death, that I say define it in behavioral terms. Secondly, once we've defined it in behavioral terms, just go back to this simple illustration, that the only way our people are going to ever internalize those behaviors is when we teach it to them with enough repetition, and the only way we'll ever teach it to them with enough repetition is when we create the rituals around it, because short of that, we're going to get bored, distracted, and quit. That's why I draw this the way I do. So I will leave you with a last question for you to decide for yourselves. It's a rhetorical question for you to be thinking about. And then I'll answer as many questions as you want. I'm around for lunch, so we go on as much as you want, or Linda will laugh. So here's the question for you. What you've got to decide is how important it is for you to lead and or build a world-class kind of an organization. And I say that in a very serious way. because we give a lot of lip service to that kind of stuff. You grab it, you see a group of athletes and you ask them, all right, so which one of you guys want to be world class? And most of them would probably raise their hand. But if you looked at how they spent their time every day, you'd say, yeah, they're not really serious about that. And the same is true of our companies. We give a lot of lip service to building these great companies. It sounds all wonderful, but are we really prepared to do what it takes? And it's okay, by the way, to say no. There's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, I have a good company. A really good company. We've got nice people, we got good marketplace presence, and we make money, and I have enough time to play golf. Nothing wrong with that. Of course, if you're in Vistage, probably part of why you're here is you may have loftier ambitions, but you don't have to. But if we are serious about building something that's really world class, well, you don't just get to say that. That requires a certain set of actions. Because I don't think it's possible to build a world class organization that doesn't have a world class culture. You can have a good one, no question, you can definitely have a good one, but I don't think you can have a world-class one. And I know for sure you can't build a world-class culture without being incredibly intentional and purposeful and systematic. So the question you have to decide is, does that matter? Is that important to you? And you're the only ones that know that. I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to answer as many questions as you want.